Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I'll never forget that night. It started like any other long drive home, the highway stretching out in front of me, endless, deserted, with nothing but my headlights cutting through the dark. The kind of night where the world feels empty, and the only sounds are the hum of your engine and the occasional rattle of a loose piece of gravel pinging off your tires. I was about an hour away from home, making good time, when I first saw her. She was standing on the shoulder, right where the highway curved sharply, illuminated by the orange glow of a distant street lamp. At first, I thought she was a mirage, one of those tricks your eyes play on you after too many hours on the road. But as I got closer, I realized she was real, and she looked scared. I slowed down, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. She didn't wave or make any kind of gesture, just stood there, hugging herself like she was freezing, despite the warm night air. Her clothes looked disheveled, a long coat hanging off her shoulders, and her hair was matted like she'd been out in the wind for hours. Every part of me screamed to keep driving, but something about her expression, the way she just stood there, stopped me. I couldn't leave her out there alone. I pulled over a few feet ahead of her and glanced in the rearview mirror. She hesitated, then started walking toward the car. My heart pounded harder than it should have. I lowered the window a crack. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended in the quiet night. She nodded but didn't say anything. I noticed her eyes, wide, darting around like she expected something to come out of the darkness behind her at any second. "Do you need a ride?" I offered, glancing at the empty highway ahead. No other cars in sight, just me and her. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then nodded again. I unlocked the passenger door, and she slid in, moving cautiously, like she wasn't sure if she should trust me. The air inside the car felt instantly heavier. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the tension of the situation. Of course she'd be nervous. She was probably in trouble, maybe running from someone or something. But that didn't explain why I couldn't seem to relax. She didn't speak as I pulled back onto the highway, just stared straight ahead, hands folded tightly in her lap. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to make sense of the situation. "Where are you headed?" I asked after a minute. She turned to look at me, her eyes dark and serious. "Just drive," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. That made me uneasy, but I nodded and kept driving. The highway stretched on, endless, and the longer we drove, the more I felt like we were the only two people left in the world. No cars passed us, no lights except for the occasional flicker of a distant sign. The quiet was suffocating. I cleared my throat, trying to break the tension. "What were you doing out there? Do you need to call someone?" "No," she said quickly. "I don't want to make any calls." "Okay," I trailed off. Maybe she was running from someone, an abusive partner, or something worse. That thought made me nervous, wondering if whoever she was running from was out there somewhere, looking for her. She must have sensed my discomfort because, after a long silence, she spoke again, her voice soft and hesitant. "Thank you for stopping." I glanced at her, but her gaze was fixed on the road ahead, her hands still tightly clasped. "Yeah, of course," I replied. "You seemed like you needed help." "I did," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. I didn't think anyone would stop." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. The air between us grew thick with unspoken questions, but I didn't push. I just drove. After a few more minutes of silence, she suddenly shifted in her seat, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. My stomach tightened. "Is someone following us?" I asked, glancing at the mirror myself. though all I saw was the empty road behind us. She didn't answer right away, just stared into the mirror like she expected to see something I couldn't. Finally, she shook her head, but her expression remained tense. No, not yet. Not yet. That sent a chill down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep my breathing steady. I wanted to ask what she meant, but something in the way she was sitting, so tense and alert, made me think I didn't want to know. The highway stretched out, long and lonely, and the further we drove, the more isolated it felt. It was like the world had faded away, leaving just the two of us in this car, in the middle of nowhere. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just barely in the edge of the rearview mirror, a flicker of movement. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced quickly behind us. Nothing, just darkness. But the woman noticed. She turned sharply in her seat, her eyes locking onto the mirror, her body going stiff. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I hesitated. "I don't know. I thought I saw something, but..." "Keep driving," she interrupted, her voice urgent now. "Don't stop." I didn't need to be told twice. My foot pressed down on the gas, and the car sped up, the hum of the engine growing louder in the still night. I kept glancing at the mirror, my pulse racing. The road behind us was still empty, but the sense of being followed, of something just out of sight, was overwhelming. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the mirror. "Faster," she whispered. I glanced at the speedometer, 80 miles per hour now, faster than I usually went, but I wasn't about to argue. The highway was still empty, no sign of any other cars or trucks, just us. And then I saw it again. This time it was unmistakable. A flash of headlights, way back in the distance, too far to make out clearly, but there. Something was back there, and it was closing in on us. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I forced myself to focus on the road. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. "Who's following us?" She didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the mirror, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Please," I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. "You need to tell me what's going on." "I don't know," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. "I don't know who they are, but they've been following me for days." "For days?" I repeated, incredulous. "Why didn't you call the police?" "I tried," she said, her voice cracking. "But every time I do, they disappear. There's never any proof. No one believes me." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. Could it? The headlights behind us were closer now, and they were gaining fast. Whoever was back there, they weren't going to let us go easily. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Just drive," she whispered. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." I floored the gas pedal, the car surging forward as the engine roared. The speedometer climbed higher, 90, 95, 100 miles per hour, but the headlights behind us kept closing in. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the headlights disappeared. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. The road behind us was dark again, completely empty. I glanced at the woman beside me, but she was still staring at the mirror, her body tense and rigid. "They're gone," I whispered, half in disbelief. "They're gone." She didn't relax, didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the mirror, her hands clenched in her lap. "They're never really gone," she murmured. "They always come back." I didn't know what to say to that. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Had we really been chased? Was it all in my head? I slowed down, just a little, my hands still trembling on the wheel. The road stretched out in front of us, empty and endless, just like before. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked after a long moment of silence. She didn't answer, just kept staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. And that's when I noticed the strangest thing of all. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, where her eyes should have been, there was nothing but darkness. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt in the middle of the empty highway, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I turned to look at her, my breath catching in my throat. But the passenger seat was empty. The woman was gone, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of road ahead. It's funny how quickly things can feel wrong, even in a place that's supposed to be your home. That's the first thing I noticed when the strange things started happening on my farm, how suddenly a sense of comfort can turn to unease. I've been working these fields for most of my life, so I know every acre like the back of my hand. Or at least I thought I did. It wasn't until a few months ago that I realized I might not be the only one out here. I remember the first time it happened clearly. It was one of those perfect late summer evenings just after sunset, where the sky is all oranges and pinks fading into deep blue. I had just finished my rounds, checking on the animals and making sure everything was locked up for the night. As I was walking back toward the house, something in the cornfield caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Those long shadows can mess with your mind after a long day. But then I realized it wasn't just a shadow. There, in the middle of the field, was a strange pattern in the corn, a perfect circle, like something had flattened the stalks down into the earth. The rest of the field was untouched, the corn standing tall and straight, but in that one spot, it looked like something had pressed down on it from above. I walked closer, feeling my heart start to race for no reason I could explain. As I reached the edge of the field, I stopped. Something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. No crickets chirping, no wind rustling the leaves. Just silence. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the circle, trying to make sense of it. I'd never seen anything like it before. Eventually, I shrugged it off as some natural occurrence. Maybe the wind had picked up in just the right way. It didn't feel like the right answer, but it was easier than considering the alternative. That something, or someone, had been out there. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of that circle from my mind. I went back out to the field, hoping to find some logical explanation in the daylight. But when I got there, the circle was gone. The corn was standing perfectly straight, like nothing had ever happened. It was as if the ground had healed overnight. That was the first sign. The first time I felt like something was watching me, just out of sight. I tried to ignore it. Life on a farm doesn't give you much time to dwell on weird things like that. There's always too much work to be done. But the feeling lingered, and over the next few weeks, it only got worse. One night, a couple of weeks after that first circle appeared, I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, trying to wind down after a long day. It was another quiet evening, the kind where you can hear the distant hum of crickets and frogs in the pond. The moon was full, casting enough light that I could see the outlines of the field stretching out around me. Everything felt peaceful, at least for a while. Then I heard it, a rustling sound coming from the cornfield, just like the one I'd heard the night the circle appeared. I froze, straining my ears to make sure I wasn't imagining things. But no, it was definitely there. Soft at first, but growing louder, like something was moving through the field, pushing the stalks aside as it went. My heart started racing. It's one thing to hear an animal or the wind stirring up the crops, but this was different. It was deliberate, like footsteps, heavy footsteps. I stood up, setting my coffee down on the porch railing, and took a few steps toward the field. The rustling stopped as soon as I moved. The silence that followed was so thick it was almost suffocating. I stood there, staring into the rows of corn, my skin crawling with unease. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Nothing. After a minute of standing there like a fool, I shook my head and turned to go back inside. But just as I reached the door, the rustling started again, louder this time, closer. That was enough for me. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night pacing the living room, listening to the sounds outside, but never daring to look out the window. By morning, it was quiet again. That's when I started to feel like I wasn't alone out here anymore. Over the next few weeks, things got stranger. Every few days, I'd find another one of those circles in the corn. They were always perfect, too perfect to be natural. No broken stalks, just flattened in a neat spiral. Sometimes they'd appear right near the edge of the field, other times deeper in where I wouldn't notice them until I was out doing work. No matter where they showed up, they always gave me the same sense of dread. And it wasn't just the circles. My animals started acting strange too. The dogs, usually so calm, would bark at nothing, staring off into the distance like they could see something I couldn't. The cows would get spooked for no reason, running around the pasture like something was chasing them, even when there was nothing there. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area near the fields. I told myself it was all in my head. After all, what else could it be? But the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became. Every night, the rustling sounds returned, and every night, they seemed to get closer. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was out there. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my boots, and headed out toward the field. The moon was high, casting long shadows over the ground as I made my way to the edge of the corn. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, my nerves on edge. The moment I stepped into the field, the rustling stopped. I shined the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the tall stalks. But there was nothing, just corn as far as the eye could see. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the flashlight tighter. And then I saw it. At the far edge of the beam, something moved. Not a person, not an animal, just a shadow, tall and thin, slipping between the rows of corn like it didn't even touch the ground. I froze, the light trembling in my hand as I watched it move closer, weaving through the stalks with a strange, unnatural grace. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The shadow didn't respond. It just kept moving, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer until it was almost at the edge of the field. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, disappearing into the night without a sound. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, sprinting back to the house as fast as I could. My heart was in my throat by the time I reached the porch, and I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow, moving so silently, so purposefully through the field. It wasn't natural, it wasn't human, but it was out there. The next morning, I went back to the field, determined to find some kind of evidence, anything to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken stalks, no sign that anything had been out there at all, except for one thing. In the middle of the field, right where I'd seen the shadow disappear, there was another circle. This one was larger than the others, more intricate. The corn wasn't just flattened, it was twisted, like something had grabbed it and spun it into a spiral. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I haven't gone back into that field at night since then. I've tried to stay away, to avoid thinking about it, but it's hard. Every time I'm out there, working the land, I can feel it. That presence, watching, waiting. I've thought about leaving the farm, packing up and moving somewhere else. But this is my home, my life. I can't just walk away from everything I've built here. But sometimes, late at night, when the rustling starts again and the dogs bark at the empty fields, I wonder if I'm making the right choice. I wonder if I should have left when I had the chance. Because whatever is out there, it's not gone. And I don't think it ever will be. There's something about a farm, about being so isolated, that makes you vulnerable to things that don't belong in the world you know. I've been here long enough to trust my instincts, to know that when something feels wrong, it probably is. And lately, Everything feels wrong. The rustling in the fields, the strange circles, the shadows. They're not natural, they're not normal, and I have a feeling they're not going to stop. But what do you do when your home turns against you? When the land you've known your whole life becomes something else, something darker, something you can't explain. You stay, you keep going, because sometimes leaving feels like giving in to something worse, and I'm not ready for that. Not yet. I've always loved road trips. There's something freeing about the open road, the way it stretches out ahead of you like an endless invitation to leave everything behind. On a road trip, you're between worlds, disconnected from whatever stress is waiting for you at home. That's what I was thinking when I decided to take the scenic route. I had plenty of time before I needed to be anywhere, and the thought of driving through the empty highways, just me and the horizon, felt like exactly what I needed. But somewhere along that endless stretch of road, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, but more like an itch at the back of my mind. It crept in slowly, almost unnoticeable at first, until I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more than usual. The road was deserted, save for the occasional semi-truck rumbling by, but that didn't explain the tension building in my chest. It had been hours since I'd seen another car or even a gas station, and the thought of stopping somewhere, anywhere, began to gnaw at me. Finally, a sign for a rest stop appeared in the distance, its blue lettering barely visible in the fading daylight. I sighed with relief and decided to pull over, figuring I could stretch my legs, use the bathroom, and maybe shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. The rest stop was like any other, quiet, nearly deserted, and surrounded by thick woods on both sides. A couple of picnic tables sat under a small pavilion, and there was a single vending machine humming softly near the entrance to the restroom. I parked my car and stepped out, the cool evening air hitting me as I stretched my stiff legs. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt. It was peaceful, but there was an odd stillness to it, like the rest stop had been frozen in time. I made my way toward the restroom, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. As I pushed open the door, I noticed something strange. There was no one else around. Usually, even at the most deserted rest stops, you'd see another traveler, a trucker maybe, or a family on their way somewhere. But this place was dead silent. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I was overthinking things. The restroom was clean enough, but the fluorescent lights flickered every few seconds, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As I washed my hands, I couldn't help but notice how the room felt bigger than it should have, like the space around me stretched out further than it did when I first walked in. I told myself it was just the weird lighting playing tricks on me. But then, I heard it, a faint whisper. I froze, my hands still under the running water. At first, I thought it was the wind or the hum of the vending machine outside. But the whisper came again, clearer this time, like someone was standing just behind me, speaking so softly I couldn't make out the words. I turned around quickly, my heart racing. The restroom was empty. No one else had come in. I was alone. I stood there, staring at the mirror, trying to rationalize what I'd just heard. Maybe it was the plumbing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of driving. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how wrong it felt. The air in the restroom seemed heavier, almost stifling, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I grabbed a paper towel, drying my hands as fast as I could, and practically ran out the door, eager to get back to the safety of my car. The cool evening air hit me again, but it didn't calm the unease that had settled deep in my gut. As I crossed the parking lot, I noticed the RV parked off to the side. It hadn't been there when I first arrived, or at least, I didn't think it had. There were no lights on inside, no signs of movement. It just sat there, silent and dark, as if it had been abandoned. But I could feel eyes on me. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. It was just an empty vehicle, probably a traveler catching some sleep before continuing on their way. Still, I couldn't help glancing at it as I hurried to my car. The windows were tinted, but the longer I stared, the more certain I was that something, or someone, was watching me from inside. I quickened my pace, the uneasy feeling returning tenfold. I climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were trembling slightly as I fumbled for the keys. The rest stop suddenly felt too quiet, too isolated. I just wanted to get out of there. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The RV door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't seen anyone step out. But I swear, in the fading light, I could make out the faintest outline of a figure standing near the doorway, watching me. I tried to calm myself, taking deep breaths as I pulled out of the parking space and onto the highway. It was probably just someone stretching their legs, I told myself. Maybe they were as tired as I was and had decided to take a break. But as I drove, that sense of being watched didn't go away. It followed me, clinging to me like a shadow. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights from the RV, but the road behind me remained empty. No cars, no lights, just the dark stretch of highway and the creeping feeling that something was wrong. The whisper came again. I nearly jumped out of my skin, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the tires on the road, but it was there. The same whisper I'd heard in the restroom. This time, I could almost make out the words, though they were jumbled, like someone speaking underwater. I turned the radio off, thinking maybe there was some interference, but the whisper didn't stop. Stop. The road. My chest tightened, panic rising in my throat. I looked around the car, my heart pounding. No one was in the back seat. The car was empty, but the whisper continued, faint but persistent. Turn. Stop. Listen. I shook my head, trying to focus on the road. I had to be imagining things. It wasn't real. I was just tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the whisper wouldn't go away. I drove for miles, the sound of the whisper growing louder and more urgent. It was still faint, still hard to understand, but it was like it was coming from inside my own head. The more I tried to focus on driving, the more insistent it became. I needed to stop. I needed to get off the highway and clear my head. Finally, I saw another rest stop sign up ahead, the blue letters glowing faintly in the distance. Without thinking, I swerved into the exit lane, my tires screeching slightly as I pulled into the empty lot. This rest stop was even more deserted than the last one, the single streetlight casting long, eerie shadows across the parking lot. I parked my car and sat there for a moment, my heart racing. The whisper had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. I looked around, half expecting to see the RV parked nearby, but there was nothing, just the empty lot and the silent road. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, telling myself that I just needed a minute to collect my thoughts. I walked toward the restroom, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I approached the door, I hesitated. The whisper was gone, but the unease was stronger than ever. I pushed open the door, half expecting to hear the whisper again. But the restroom was silent. I splashed some cold water on my face, trying to shake the tension from my shoulders. I stood there for a moment, staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. And that's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder, closer, until I was certain someone else was in the restroom with me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the room was empty. No one was there. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick, like something was waiting just out of sight. I bolted for the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a wall, but it did nothing to calm the rising panic in my chest. I hurried back to my car, locking the doors behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my hands shaking. For a second, I thought I saw something, just a shadow, barely visible in the dim light, slip between the trees near the rest stop. But when I blinked, it was gone. I sat there for a moment, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The whisper was gone, the footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I didn't care anymore. I wasn't staying. I floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as I sped out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. My heart raced, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. As I drove, the whisper didn't come back. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and dark, but the feeling that something was following me never left. Even now, miles away from that rest stop, I can still feel it, that creeping unease, like something is just out of sight, waiting. I haven't stopped at a rest stop since. The road can be a strange place at night. You think you're alone, but there's always something lurking in the shadows, something you can't quite see. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just hear it too. There's something eerie about being out on the ocean at night. No matter how big the boat, how calm the water, that endless blackness stretching out around you can make you feel small, like you're the only thing left in the world. I've always loved the water, ever since I was a kid. But being on a cruise by yourself, surrounded by strangers, somehow changes that feeling. It turns from a peaceful solitude into something more unsettling, more isolating. I'd booked this cruise last minute. Work had been hell. My relationships felt like they were fraying at the edges, and I needed to get away. A week at sea, no emails, no phone calls, just me, the open water, and my thoughts. It sounded perfect. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent my time lounging by the pool, reading, and occasionally making awkward small talk with the other passengers. But I didn't mind. I wasn't there to make friends. On the third night, though, something shifted. It started when I noticed that some of the people I'd seen on the first day, people I was sure I'd talked to or passed by, were gone. It's normal for passengers to keep to themselves, especially on a cruise this size. But there were a few faces I distinctly remembered. A couple that had been seated at my table during the first night's dinner, a group of friends always laughing by the bar, even a family with 2 kids who had been running through the hallways, giggling. All of them had vanished. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just keeping to their cabins, or maybe I hadn't been paying enough attention. But as the days went on, I realized I wasn't seeing them anywhere, by the pool, in the dining room, on the deck. No one seemed to mention them either, like they had never been there at all. On the 4th night, it got worse. I was sitting on one of the upper decks, enjoying the evening breeze, the gentle hum of the ship's engines lulling me into a relaxed state. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like tiny pinpricks of light, and the ocean stretched out in every direction, dark and endless. I could hear the soft murmur of other passengers below me, laughter, clinking glasses. It was peaceful. But then I noticed something strange. At the far end of the deck, near the rail, there was a man standing completely still, his back to me. He was dressed in a dark jacket, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was staring intently at something in the water. I couldn't tell why, but something about him made me uneasy. He wasn't leaning on the rail, or moving at all, just standing there, motionless. I watched him for a while, expecting him to turn around or walk away, but he didn't. He stayed rooted in that spot, staring at the ocean. After what felt like an eternity, I finally stood up, thinking maybe I'd go back to my cabin and call it a night. But as I walked past him, something strange happened. The sounds of the ship, the laughter, the music, the faint conversations, faded away. It was like I'd stepped into a vacuum, and the only thing I could hear was the steady rhythm of the waves against the hull. It wasn't just quiet, it was silence. Complete, unnatural silence. I stopped, glancing back at the man. He hadn't moved, but now I could see that his hands were clenched tightly at his sides, his knuckles white in the dim light. I shivered, suddenly feeling exposed, like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to witness. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I'd intended. He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch, as if he hadn't heard me. I stepped closer, keeping a safe distance, but close enough to see his profile. His face was expressionless, his eyes locked on the horizon. For a moment, I thought he wasn't breathing. Before I could say anything else, a sudden chill ran down my spine, and I felt the overwhelming urge to leave. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on him until I was sure I was far enough to turn and walk quickly toward the stairs. As soon as I reached the main deck, the sounds of the ship rushed back. Laughter, music, everything. I felt like I had stepped out of a dream. I glanced around at the other passengers, but no one seemed to notice that anything strange had happened. No one seemed to notice the man on the upper deck either. That night, back in my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? Why had he just been standing there, completely still? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't seen him before. Not at dinner, not by the pool, nowhere. It was like he had appeared out of nowhere. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, blank and lifeless, staring out at the ocean. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of something tapping against my cabin door. At first, I thought it was just the gentle sway of the ship causing things to shift, but the tapping continued, persistent and deliberate. My heart raced as I got out of bed and walked slowly to the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Nothing. The tapping had stopped. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the doorknob, debating whether or not I should open it. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, glancing up and down the corridor. Nothing seemed out of place, but the eerie silence that I'd felt on the upper deck earlier was back, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. Just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something strange on the floor outside my cabin. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, was lying just in front of the door frame. I bent down, my fingers trembling slightly as I picked it up. There was no writing on the outside, just a plain, unmarked slip of paper. I unfolded it, half expecting to find some message or note. But all that was inside was a single word, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Watch. I stared at the word, my mind racing. Watch what? What was this supposed to mean? I stuffed the paper into my pocket and quickly closed the door, locking it behind me. My thoughts were spinning. Between the man on the deck, the strange silence, and now this note. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong on this ship. But what could I do? I couldn't exactly go to the captain and tell him about a strange man and a mysterious note without sounding completely paranoid. For the rest of the night, I barely slept. Every creak of the ship, every faint sound outside my cabin sent my heart racing. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw that single word, watch. The next morning, I was determined to find some answers. I made my way to the reception desk, hoping someone could tell me if they'd seen the man from the night before. But when I asked, the receptionist gave me a blank look. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head. "There haven't been any reports of someone fitting that description." I tried to explain what had happened, but the more I talked, the more ridiculous it sounded. A man standing still on the deck, the strange silence, the note. None of it made any sense. I could tell she wasn't taking me seriously, so I thanked her and left, feeling more confused than ever. For the rest of the day, I kept to myself, avoiding the upper decks and sticking to the crowded areas of the ship. But even in the bustling dining room or the pool deck, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickle on the back of my neck, but it grew stronger as the day went on. That night, I decided to stay in my cabin, hoping to avoid any more strange encounters. But just as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again, the tapping on my door. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to open the door. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay where I was, to ignore it. But the tapping continued, and with it, that overwhelming sense of being watched. I forced myself to move, my legs shaking as I crossed the room. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and yanked it open. The hallway was empty, but there, on the floor, was another piece of paper, just like the one from the night before. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. "It's watching you." I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. I didn't know what was happening or who was leaving these notes, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone on this ship. Something, or someone, was watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my bags, ready to leave the moment the ship docked. The remaining days of the cruise passed in a blur, each one filled with an uneasy sense of dread. I stayed away from the upper decks, avoided the dark corners of the ship, and kept my cabin door locked. When the cruise finally ended, I was the first one off the ship, eager to leave whatever strange presence had been following me behind. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere, watching. I never thought the woods could feel so claustrophobic. Growing up, the forest had always been my escape, wide open, peaceful, a place to clear my head. But that all changed on this particular hike. It was supposed to be a quick overnight trip with my friend Matt, nothing we hadn't done a dozen times before. Just a chance to disconnect from the world, pitch a tent, and unwind in nature. But the deeper we went, the more it felt like the trees were closing in on us, swallowing us whole. We'd started the hike early that morning, following a familiar trail through the dense forest. The sun was out, the birds were singing, and we were in good spirits, talking about everything and nothing as the trail wound through the trees. The path was well worn, and even though we hadn't been here in a few years, it was easy to find our way, or so we thought. It wasn't until the sun began to dip below the horizon that things started to feel off. I can't explain exactly what it was at first. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. Or maybe it was the strange silence that seemed to settle over the forest as the day wore on. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. "We should set up camp soon," Matt said, glancing at the darkening sky. "We're losing light." I nodded, wiping the sweat from my forehead as I looked around. "Yeah, let's find a good spot." We veered off the trail slightly, heading toward a small clearing we'd passed earlier. It seemed like a good enough place to set up for the night. Flat ground, plenty of room for our tent, and far enough off the main trail that we wouldn't be bothered by any other hikers. But as we unpacked and started setting up the tent, I noticed something strange. "Hey, Matt," I called, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness of the woods. "Does this place look familiar to you?" He looked up from where he was hammering in a tent stake, frowning. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, glancing around. "It's just, I swear we passed this clearing earlier, but the trail's over there, right?" Matt shrugged. "Probably just looks the same as every other clearing. We've been walking through trees for hours, man. Everything's starting to blur together." I laughed, though the unease still gnawed at me. "Yeah, you're probably right." We finished setting up the tent and built a small fire as the last light of the day faded into the deep blue of twilight. The woods were quiet, eerily so. Usually, you'd hear the sounds of crickets or distant rustling in the trees. But tonight, it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Matt didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. We sat around the fire, talking in low voices, watching the flames dance. But the feeling of being watched never left me. After a while, Matt yawned and stretched, tossing another log onto the fire. "I'm beat. Think I'm gonna turn in." I nodded, though I didn't feel tired at all. Something about the woods tonight had me on edge, like the trees were hiding something just out of sight. But I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I forced a smile. "Yeah, I'll join you in a bit." Matt disappeared into the tent, leaving me alone by the fire. The flames flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the trees. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, my ears straining for any sound, any movement. And then, I heard it. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. A rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps. I sat up straighter, my heart pounding in my chest. "Matt?" I called, though I knew it wasn't him. The footsteps were too far away, coming from the trees behind me. There was no answer. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to stop just at the edge of the clearing, hidden by the thick shadows of the forest. I stood up, my pulse racing. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and shined it toward the edge of the clearing, sweeping the beam of light across the trees. Nothing, just the dense underbrush and the tall, looming trunks of the pines. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see who or what they belonged to. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I lowered the flashlight. The fire crackled softly behind me, casting just enough light to keep the darkness at bay. But I knew whatever was out there, watching, was waiting for the fire to die down. I turned and quickly ducked into the tent, zipping it up behind me. Matt was already asleep, his soft snores filling the small space. I lay down beside him, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The night passed in fits of restless sleep, my mind replaying the sound of those footsteps over and over again. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to the sensation of being watched, like something was standing just outside the tent, waiting for us to let our guard down. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. Matt, of course, was completely oblivious to what had happened during the night. He stretched and yawned, completely refreshed. "Ready to hit the trail?" he asked, grinning as he packed up his gear. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready for anything. I just wanted to get out of those woods. We set off early, hoping to make good time before the sun got too high. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd hear that same rustling sound behind us, the soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Do you hear that?" I asked Matt after about an hour of hiking, my voice low. "Hear what?" "That sound, like someone's walking behind us." Matt stopped and listened for a moment, frowning. But the forest was quiet. The only sound the occasional call of a bird in the distance. "Man, you've got to chill," Matt said, laughing. "I think you're just spooking yourself." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. And the further we walked, the more convinced I became that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we came across the second clearing that I realized something was seriously wrong. "We've been here before," I said, my heart sinking as I looked around. Matt frowned, glancing at the trees. "What? No way. We've been walking in a straight line. I swear to you, this is the same clearing we camped in last night." Matt looked around again, his confidence wavering. "It's just a coincidence," he said, though his voice was less certain now. "This whole forest looks the same. You're just confused." But I wasn't confused. I knew we had passed this exact spot. The fallen tree at the edge of the clearing, the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, everything was identical to where we had set up camp the night before. "We're lost," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Matt didn't want to admit it, but I could see the doubt creeping into his expression. "No, we're not," he insisted. "We'll just keep going. We'll find the trail." But no matter which direction we went, no matter how far we walked, the forest around us never seemed to change. Every tree, every clearing looked the same. It was like we were trapped in a loop, walking in circles with no way out. By midday, Matt finally admitted what I had known all along. We were lost. We stopped to rest, the sun beating down through the canopy, and that's when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were louder, closer. I stood up, scanning the trees around us, my pulse racing. "Did you hear that?" Matt nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it." The footsteps were unmistakable now, crunching through the underbrush, moving steadily toward us, but there was no one in sight. "We need to move," I said, grabbing my backpack. "Now." We hurried through the forest, our pace quickening with every step. The footsteps followed, always just behind us, keeping pace no matter how fast we went. Every time I looked back, I saw nothing, but I knew something was there. Something was tracking us. The sun was starting to set when we stumbled into the clearing again, the same one for the third time that day. My heart sank. We were trapped. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't escape this loop. "We can't stay here," Matt said, his voice trembling. But we had no choice. The sun was setting, and we couldn't keep running in circles. We set up camp again, though neither of us spoke much. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the unspoken fear that whatever was following us was getting closer. That night, as we sat by the fire, I could feel it. Watching, waiting. The footsteps had stopped, but the presence was still there, lurking just out of sight. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't alone in those woods, and I wasn't sure we'd ever find our way out. There's something about the woods that can make even the most familiar places feel foreign. We thought we knew the trail, thought we could handle a simple overnight hike, but the forest had other plans. To this day, I still don't know what was out there, following us. All I know is that we barely made it back. You'd think that after 10 years of driving long-haul trucks, you'd get used to the quiet stretches of road, the endless highways that disappear into the horizon, and the hours of isolation, and for the most part, you do. But every now and then, something happens out there that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Something that reminds you that no matter how many miles you've logged, no matter how much you think you know the road, there are still things that can make your blood run cold. That night, I was driving through one of those long, empty stretches of highway that seemed to go on forever. It was just me, the hum of the engine, and the sound of my tires rolling over the asphalt. No other cars in sight. Nothing but darkness on either side of the road, and the faint glow of my headlights lighting the way ahead. I'd been on the road for hours, heading west through the desert, the kind of place where you don't see a gas station for miles. My next stop wasn't for another 2 hours, so I settled in, trying to keep my mind occupied with the usual tricks. Radio on low, window cracked for some fresh air. I'd done this route more times than I could count, but that night, something felt different. About an hour in, I spotted it, a beat-up old van, parked at the side of the road, half hidden in the shadows. The headlights were off, and the windows were dark. I couldn't see anyone inside, but there was something about it that caught my attention. Maybe it was the way it seemed abandoned, or the fact that it was parked just off the highway, not in a rest area, not near a gas station, just there. I drove past it, not thinking much of it at first. But a few miles down the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it again. The same van, or at least one that looked exactly like it. Far back, barely visible, but keeping pace with me. My stomach did a little flip. I told myself it was just a coincidence. There are a lot of vans out there, and it's not uncommon for someone to pull over for a rest or a break. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I shook it off, trying to focus on the road ahead. But after another 10 minutes, I checked the mirror again, and the van was still there. This time, it was closer. Now, I'm not one to scare easy. I've been in all kinds of situations out on the road, storms, near misses, even a few shady characters at truck stops. But this was different. Something about that van felt off. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe they were just following the same route, heading to the same destination. Maybe it was nothing. But the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I kept driving, trying to ignore it. But the van stayed in my rear view, never getting closer, never falling behind. Just there, like a shadow, lurking on the edge of my vision. I started to think about pulling over at the next rest stop, but I wasn't sure that would help. What if they pulled over too? What then? No. I needed to figure out if this was just a coincidence, or if something more was going on. Up ahead, the highway curved, and I saw a small truck stop coming into view, just a single gas station and a diner, the kind of place that's open 24 hours but always feels deserted in the dead of night. I decided to pull in. If the van followed, I'd know something was wrong. I slowed down, signaling as I pulled off the highway and into the truck stop parking lot. I kept one eye on the rear view, waiting to see if the van would do the same. It did. My heart rate picked up as I watched the van pull off the highway, parking a few spaces away from me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could still be a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. There was no reason for them to pull off at this little truck stop unless they were following me. I sat there for a moment, my hand resting on the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do next. I didn't want to get out of the truck. I didn't want to confront whoever was in that van. But I couldn't just sit there all night either. Finally, I made up my mind. I grabbed my phone, pretending to check it, and then casually opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. I glanced around the parking lot, trying to act like I wasn't bothered, but my eyes kept drifting back to the van. No one got out. The windows were too dark to see inside, but I could feel eyes on me. I walked toward the diner, figuring I could grab a cup of coffee and maybe buy myself some time to think. As I reached the door, I glanced back one last time. The van hadn't moved, but there was something about the way it just sat there, waiting, that sent a chill down my spine. Inside the diner, it was quiet, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzz, and the only sound is the clink of dishes from the kitchen. The waitress behind the counter barely glanced at me as I sat down, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the pot on the table. I took a sip, trying to steady my nerves. My hands were shaking slightly, and I hated how unsettled I felt. It wasn't like me to get spooked, especially by something as simple as a van. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was in that van had been following me for a reason. I glanced out the window, but from where I was sitting, I couldn't see the parking lot. I took another sip of coffee, my mind racing with possibilities. Should I call someone? The police? But what would I even tell them? That I thought a van was following me? They'd probably think I was crazy. After a few minutes, I stood up, tossing some bills on the table before heading back to my truck. As I walked out of the diner, I could feel the tension in the air, the quiet stillness that comes when you know something isn't right. The van was still there. I quickened my pace, climbing back into my truck and locking the doors behind me. I took a deep breath. my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. Maybe if I just kept driving, they'd eventually give up. I started the engine, pulling out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to hope that it was over, that maybe the van had just been some coincidence, some weird fluke. But then I saw it again, in the mirror. The van was back, trailing me at a distance. My chest tightened as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't a coincidence. They were following me. I pressed down on the gas, speeding up as the road stretched out ahead of me. The van kept pace, never getting too close, but never falling too far behind. My hands were slick with sweat, my mind racing through a dozen different scenarios, none of them good. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had to lose them. I couldn't pull over. I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. The road ahead was dark and empty, just miles of desert stretching out on either side. I pushed the truck harder, watching as the speedometer climbed, the engine roaring beneath me. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the headlights of the van vanished. I blinked, glancing in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty. No sign of the van, no headlights, just darkness. I slowed down, my heart still pounding. Where had they gone? They couldn't have just disappeared. I kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road and the mirror, waiting for the van to reappear, but it didn't. The highway remained empty, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the soft whistle of the wind through the cracked window. Eventually, the tension in my chest began to ease. Maybe they'd given up. Maybe they'd finally gotten bored and turned off somewhere. I didn't know, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I wasn't going to stop until I was sure they were gone for good. I drove through the night, not daring to pull over until the sun began to rise. When I finally stopped at a rest area, I sat there for a long moment, just staring at the empty road, waiting for any sign of the van. But it never came. To this day, I don't know who was in that van or why they were following me. All I know is that I've never seen it again, but every time I'm out on the road, driving those long, empty highways, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it lurking there, just behind me, waiting. The road can be a lonely place, but sometimes it's not the isolation that gets to you. Sometimes it's the feeling that you're not alone after all. There's something about the mountains that makes you feel like you've stepped into another world. The air is thinner, sharper, and the silence is deeper, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant cry of an animal. I've always loved that feeling, the sense of being completely removed from the chaos of everyday life. But I never expected that sense of isolation to turn into something far more unsettling. It all started on a road trip with my friend Emily. We'd been planning it for months, a weekend getaway in the mountains, just the two of us, some hiking, a cozy cabin, and plenty of fresh air. Everything was going perfectly until we decided to take a detour on the way to the cabin. The GPS showed us a shortcut, a narrow, winding mountain road that promised to cut our travel time by nearly an hour. At first, it seemed like a good idea. The road was quiet, with barely any other cars, and the scenery was beautiful, trees stretching high above us, their leaves just beginning to turn gold and orange with the change of season. The air was crisp, the sky a perfect blue, and the drive was peaceful. But as we got deeper into the mountains, the road started to change. It narrowed even more, the pavement giving way to gravel and dirt, and the trees closed in on either side, their branches casting long shadows across the road. The GPS signal flickered, then cut out entirely, leaving us on our own. I glanced at Emily, feeling a little uneasy. "Are we sure this is the right way?" I asked, my voice more casual than I felt. Emily looked down at her phone, frowning at the blank screen. "Well, it's the only way now. Let's just keep going. The cabin's probably not too far." I nodded, but something about the road felt off. It wasn't just the isolation or the fact that the GPS had cut out. There was something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The further we drove, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, just the steady hum of the car's engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, far off in the distance, standing at the edge of the road, partially hidden by the trees. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. It was tall, much taller than a person, with long limbs and an unnatural stillness. My first thought was that it was some kind of animal, maybe a deer or an elk, but something about the way it stood there, so still, sent a chill down my spine. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily glanced up from her phone. "See what?" "There's something up ahead," I said, pointing toward the figure. But when I looked again, it was gone. The road was empty. Emily squinted, leaning forward in her seat. "I don't see anything." I shook my head, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was just a shadow, or a tree. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been something else, something watching us. We kept driving, the road twisting and turning as we climbed higher into the mountains. The trees grew thicker, their branches hanging low over the road, and the light started to fade, even though it was only late afternoon. The sun barely broke through the canopy, casting everything in an eerie, golden light. That's when I saw it again. This time it was closer, the same tall figure, standing just at the edge of the road, half hidden behind the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowed the car. My eyes locked on it. It wasn't an animal. I didn't know what it was, but it was watching us. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, more to myself than to Emily. She followed my gaze, but by the time she looked, the figure had slipped back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. "Are you messing with me?" Emily asked, her tone light, but I could hear the nervousness underneath. "No," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "I swear, there's something out there. Something's watching us." Emily stared at me for a moment, then looked back out the window, her expression tense. "Let's just get to the cabin. We'll feel better once we're off this road." I nodded, but the unease in my stomach was growing. I pressed down on the gas, trying to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The road seemed to stretch on forever, each turn revealing more of the same dense trees and winding gravel path. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, my eyes flicking between the road and the trees, waiting for the figure to appear again. And then, just as we rounded a particularly sharp bend, it did. This time, it was right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the loose gravel as we came to a stop. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw it too. It was tall, at least 7 feet, its limbs long and thin, its skin a pale, sickly gray. Its head was too small for its body, and its eyes were large, dark, and hollow, staring at us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. We sat there frozen, staring at the thing as it stood in the road, unmoving. It didn't make a sound, didn't move toward us, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and oppressive, like it was waiting for something. "What the hell is that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking, "but we need to get out of here." I shifted the car into reverse, my heart pounding as I started to back up. But the thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. The road behind us was narrow, and I struggled to keep the car steady as I backed up, my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the thing in front of us. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stepped off the road and vanished into the trees. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I threw the car into drive and sped down the road, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. My heart was still racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I'd just seen. "What the hell was that?" Emily asked again, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "I don't know." We drove in silence for a while, the light fading even more as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the road. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in the trees, just a flicker of movement, barely visible. But every time I looked closer, there was nothing there. Finally, after what felt like hours, the road widened, and we saw a sign for the cabin. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding as we turned off the gravel road and onto the narrow driveway leading to the cabin. The cabin itself was small, nestled among the trees, but it looked warm and inviting compared to the darkness of the woods around it. I parked the car and turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. We sat there for a moment, neither of us wanting to get out of the car. "You think it's gone?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we're here. We should just get inside." We grabbed our bags and hurried inside the cabin, locking the door behind us. The cabin was cozy, with a small fireplace and a few windows that looked out onto the trees. But the sense of relief I'd expected didn't come. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we'd seen on the road was still out there, watching us. We spent the rest of the evening in silence, barely talking, both of us too on edge to relax. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside made my heart race, and I could tell Emily felt the same. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure we'd seen, the way it had stood there in the middle of the road, watching us, the way it had disappeared into the trees without a sound. And then, just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard it. A soft rustling sound coming from outside the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, like something was moving through the trees, heading straight for the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Emily was asleep in the bed across from mine, completely unaware of the noise outside. I got out of bed, moving slowly, quietly, and crept toward the window. My hands shook as I reached for the curtains, pulling them back just enough to peer outside. And that's when I saw it. The figure, standing just beyond the edge of the trees, its dark eyes locked on the cabin. Watching. Waiting. The mountains can be beautiful. Peaceful, even. But there's something about their isolation that makes them feel different. You think you're alone, but you're not. Something's always out there watching. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, it lets you see it too. You don't expect to feel unsettled out on the water. For me, fishing has always been a kind of escape, a way to leave everything behind and let the world fall silent around me. There's something comforting about the quiet of the lake, the gentle bob of the boat, the way the only sound is the ripple of the water against the hull. But that day, something was different. It wasn't just the stillness. It was the way the air felt heavy, thick, like the lake was holding its breath. I'd been out on that lake 100 times before. It's not far from where I grew up. A small, quiet spot tucked away in the woods. Hardly anyone comes out here anymore. Most people prefer the bigger lakes, the ones with more fish and fewer weeds. But I like the solitude. It's just you, the water, and the endless stretch of trees. That morning started off like any other. I packed up my gear, loaded it into the old rowboat, and pushed off from the shore. The lake was calm, the water smooth as glass, reflecting the early morning sky. The fog hadn't quite lifted yet, and the trees on the far side of the lake were just faint shadows in the distance. It was perfect. I rowed out to my usual spot near the middle of the lake, where the water was deepest, and cast my line. For a while, nothing happened. That was normal, though. Fishing isn't about the catch. It's about the waiting, the quiet, the anticipation. I leaned back, letting the stillness wash over me. But then, something strange happened. I felt a pull on the line. It was soft at first, like something just brushing against the hook, but then it got stronger, much stronger. My hands tightened around the rod as I braced myself, thinking I must have hooked a big one. The rod bent sharply, and I had to stand up to keep control of it. But as I started reeling it in, something didn't feel right. For one thing, whatever I'd hooked was heavy, not the usual resistance of a fish fighting to get away, but a dead weight, like I'd snagged something deep beneath the surface. I tried to reel it in slowly, my heart racing with excitement at what might be on the other end. Maybe I'd caught the biggest fish of my life. But the further I pulled, the stranger it felt. The line came up slowly, dragging against the water like it was pulling something massive. Then, just as I got it close to the surface, I saw it. At first, it looked like an old fishing net, tangled and frayed, covered in mud and weeds. I let out a breath, a little disappointed but curious. People sometimes left their gear out here, and it wasn't unusual to catch an old net or piece of trash. But as I kept pulling, I noticed something strange. The net wasn't empty. Caught in the tangled mess were bits of metal, old and rusted, barely recognizable. I frowned, pulling the net closer to the boat so I could get a better look. Among the pieces of metal were fragments of what looked like decaying fabric, faded and brittle. It was like I'd pulled up the remnants of something that had been sitting at the bottom of the lake for years. A chill ran down my spine as I untangled the net from my hook. What was this stuff? I wasn't sure, but the thought of it being down there, hidden beneath the surface all this time, made me uneasy. I dropped the net back into the water and sat back, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. The lake was quiet again, the surface smooth and undisturbed, but the air felt different now, heavier, colder. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I'd probably hooked an old piece of a boat or some debris that had been there for ages. Nothing to worry about. I cast my line again, determined to enjoy the rest of the morning, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. The water, usually so calm and inviting, now felt darker, deeper, like it was hiding something beneath the surface. Every time the boat rocked, I found myself glancing over the side, half expecting to see something staring back at me. And then, just as I was about to reel in my line for the last time, it happened. The line went taut, pulling hard, much harder than before. My hands gripped the rod tightly, and I leaned back, trying to keep control. Whatever I'd hooked this time, it was strong, stronger than any fish I'd ever caught. My heart raced as I started to reel it in, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of monster fish, something lurking in the depths that no one had ever seen before. But as I pulled, that same heavy, dragging sensation returned. The line cut through the water, and I could feel the weight of something massive on the other end, something that didn't move like a fish. It wasn't fighting, it was just there, pulling me down with it. I stood up, bracing myself as I hauled the line in with all my strength. The boat rocked under the strain, the water churning around me, and I gritted my teeth, determined to see what was on the other end. And then, with a sudden jerk, the line went slack. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the boat as the tension vanished. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the line, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I looked down. Bubbles. They were rising from the spot where the line had gone slack, a steady stream of bubbles breaking the surface of the water. At first, they were small, barely noticeable, but then they grew larger, more violent, churning the water around the boat. My stomach twisted with a sick feeling of dread. Something was down there, something big, and it was coming to the surface. I backed away from the edge of the boat, my eyes locked on the bubbling water. The surface rippled, the bubbles growing faster and more intense. I could feel the boat rocking beneath me, the water swirling around it as if something was moving beneath the surface, circling. And then, without warning, the bubbles stopped. The lake was still again, the water smooth and quiet, as if nothing had happened. But the feeling of dread was stronger than ever. I stared at the spot where the bubbles had been, my heart racing, waiting for something, anything, to break the surface. But nothing did. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hands trembling, my mind racing with all the things that could be hiding beneath the water. But the lake remained quiet, the surface undisturbed. Finally, I forced myself to sit down, my breath coming in shaky gasps. I needed to get out of there. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to find out. I grabbed the oars and started rowing, my arms shaking from the effort. The boat moved slowly, too slowly, and every creak of the wood made my heart jump. I kept glancing over the side, half expecting to see something rising from the depths, but the lake remained still. As I rowed toward the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees lining the edge of the lake loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze, but I couldn't see anything, or anyone. Still, the sensation of eyes on me, from beneath the water or from the shadows of the forest, clung to me like a weight on my chest. When I finally reached the shore, I pulled the boat onto the bank and collapsed onto the grass, my hands trembling. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the lake, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no explanation, no rational answer for the strange catch, the bubbling water, the feeling that something was watching me. I packed up my gear and left as quickly as I could, the weight of the lake's dark water pressing on my mind the entire drive home. I haven't been back to that lake since. I don't plan to. There are some things better left undisturbed, some places that hold secrets you're not meant to uncover, and that lake, with its still water and hidden depths, is one of them. Fishing is supposed to be peaceful, a way to connect with nature and escape the world. But sometimes, nature has its own plans. Sometimes, the things that lie beneath the surface are better left alone. You know that feeling you get when you take a wrong turn? That little jolt in your stomach when the road stops looking familiar? And suddenly, you realize you're somewhere you've never been before. I had that feeling the entire time I was driving down that abandoned road. It was late, I was tired, and the GPS had lost signal miles ago. But the road had seemed like a shortcut. At least that's what I thought when I first turned onto it. It was one of those narrow, winding roads that snake through the middle of nowhere. No streetlights, no traffic, just the endless stretch of cracked pavement cutting through a dense forest. The trees were so thick on either side that their branches tangled above me, blocking out what little moonlight there was. The only light came from my headlights, casting long shadows that flickered and danced as I drove. I glanced at my phone, hoping for some sign of life. Maybe a bar of signal or even a hint of the GPS finding its way back. But the screen was dark, and the battery was quickly draining. Great. I was starting to wonder if I should turn around when my headlights caught something up ahead. There, on the side of the road, was an old, beat-up car. It looked like it had been sitting there for a while, rusted, with its windows smashed in and its doors wide open. I slowed down as I approached, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of someone nearby, but there was no one. Just the car, sitting there like a forgotten relic. I should have kept driving. I should have ignored it and kept going. But something made me stop. I pulled over, turning off the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring at the car. The air was thick with the sound of insects buzzing in the trees, but underneath that was a strange, oppressive silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I rolled down the window, hoping to hear something, Anything, but there was nothing. My curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The air was cooler than I expected, the kind of chill that clings to your skin even on a summer night. I shivered as I walked toward the abandoned car, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. Up close, the car looked even worse. The paint was peeling, and the tires were flat, sunken into the ground like the car had been there for years. The inside was a mess, papers scattered across the seats, an old jacket thrown in the back, and something I couldn't quite make out in the front passenger seat. I shined my flashlight inside, and that's when I saw it. A doll. It was just sitting there, propped up against the seat, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. The hair was matted, the dress torn, but it was the eyes that got to me, wide and unblinking, like it was waiting for something. I took a step back, the uneasy feeling in my stomach twisting tighter. There was no reason for anyone to leave a doll like that in an abandoned car. No reason at all. I turned back toward my car, ready to leave, when I heard it. A rustling sound, faint but close. I froze, my heart pounding. It came from the trees just behind the car, the sound of something or someone moving through the underbrush. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I shined the flashlight toward the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift, moving in the flickering light, but I didn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was being paranoid. The car was creepy, sure, but that didn't mean anything. It was probably just an animal in the woods, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I forced myself to move, to walk back to my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the reflection of the side mirror, was a figure. Tall, thin, standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the abandoned car. I could only make out the shape, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the figure. Nothing. The trees were still, the road empty, but I knew what I'd seen. Someone, or something, had been there, watching me. My hands were shaking as I got into the car, locking the doors behind me. I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I started the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the road ahead. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, but there was nothing. I pressed down on the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away from the abandoned car. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in on either side, and every so often, I glanced in the mirrors, searching for any sign of movement. But the figure didn't appear again. At least, not right away. It wasn't until I'd been driving for a few more miles that I noticed something strange. The road, this road that I had never been on before, was starting to look familiar. The same cracked pavement, the same overhanging branches, the same sharp turns. I frowned, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I couldn't have been driving in circles, that was impossible, but the feeling of déjà vu was undeniable. And then, up ahead, my headlights caught something on the side of the road, the abandoned car. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the scene in front of me. The same rusted car, the same smashed windows, the same open doors. I had just left this place. There was no way I could have ended up back here. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck as I tried to make sense of it. Maybe I had gotten turned around. Maybe the road had looped back somehow. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The air inside the car felt heavy, stifling. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. But before I could make a decision, the rustling sound came again. This time, it was louder, closer. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The figure, it was standing in the middle of the road, directly behind my car. Its form was just barely illuminated by the red glow of my brake lights, tall and thin, its head tilted slightly as if it were watching me. I couldn't make out any features, just the dark outline of its body, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I panicked. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I tore down the road. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away from that thing, whatever it was. The road blurred in front of me, the trees whipping by in a dark green blur. I drove faster than I should have, taking the curves at breakneck speed, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far from that place as possible. But no matter how far I drove, that feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again, standing in the middle of the road, watching me. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a sign for the highway. Relief washed over me as I turned onto the familiar stretch of road, the streetlights flickering above me. The sense of dread slowly faded, replaced by the familiar hum of the engine and the comforting rhythm of the tires against the pavement. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, my mind replaying everything that had happened. The abandoned car, the figure in the trees, the way the road had seemed to loop back on itself. None of it made sense. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I sat there for a moment, the engine still running, trying to process everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something that night, something I wasn't meant to see. I don't take back roads anymore, not after that night. There are too many places where the world feels thin, where the familiar twists into something darker, something that watches from the shadows, and once you've seen it, you never forget it. The road can take you anywhere, but sometimes it takes you somewhere you're not meant to go, somewhere you might not come back from the same. There's a certain kind of quiet that you only get when you're deep in the woods at night. It's not the peaceful quiet of a calm evening. It's the kind that feels almost too still, too unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. That's the kind of quiet I found myself in, sitting around a campfire with a couple of friends in the middle of a national park, miles away from anything that even remotely resembled civilization. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks, and it felt like a good escape. No phones, no work, just us and nature. We'd hiked all day, set up camp near a small stream, and settled in for the night with a fire crackling and the stars just starting to peek out from behind the trees. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. It started with the lights. At first, I didn't notice them. We were too caught up in conversation, laughing and swapping stories, enjoying the warmth of the fire. But then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a faint, glowing light moving through the trees. I turned my head, squinting into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the fire, or even another camper in the distance with a flashlight. But the more I watched, the more I realized this light wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It was moving too fast, too smoothly, gliding through the forest in a way that didn't seem natural. And there wasn't just one light. There were several, small, glowing orbs darting between the trees, appearing and disappearing like they were playing some kind of game. I nudged my friend Jake, who was sitting next to me. "Hey, do you see that?" He followed my gaze, his face scrunching up in confusion. "What, the lights?" "Yeah, what do you think they are?" He shrugged, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. "I don't know. Probably other campers, flashlights or something." But I knew that wasn't right. There was no campground nearby, no trails, nothing but miles of dense forest. And no flashlight moved like that. No flashlight glowed with that strange, pale light. Emily, sitting across from us, must have noticed the change in our expressions because she turned around, her eyes widening as she saw the lights for herself. "What the hell?" she whispered, leaning closer to the fire. For a few minutes, none of us said anything. We just watched, our conversation forgotten. As the lights danced through the trees, they moved in and out of sight, always staying just far enough away that we couldn't make out what was causing them. Every so often, they'd flicker and vanish, only to reappear in a different part of the forest. "Maybe it's fireflies," Emily suggested, though her voice was unconvincing. "Fireflies don't glow like that," Jake muttered, his eyes never leaving the lights. I stood up, stepping away from the warmth of the fire, my curiosity getting the better of me. "I'm going to check it out." Jake grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Dude, you don't know what's out there." I hesitated, glancing back at the lights. They were still there, still moving, and something about them called to me, pulling at my curiosity in a way I couldn't explain. "I'll just get a little closer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I won't go far." Emily stood up too, her face pale in the glow of the fire. "I don't think that's a good idea." But I was already moving, my feet carrying me toward the edge of the clearing before I could second-guess myself. The lights seemed to brighten as I approached, and I found myself drawn to them, like a moth to a flame. The air was cooler as I stepped into the trees, the sounds of the forest muffled under the weight of the silence. I could still hear Jake and Emily behind me, their voices low and anxious, but the lights were all I could focus on. They were closer now, hovering just beyond the first line of trees. I stepped carefully, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I couldn't stop. I had to see what they were. As I moved closer, the lights suddenly flickered, their glow intensifying for a moment before dimming again. They weren't random. They were moving with purpose, like they were leading me somewhere. The further I went, the more the woods seemed to change around me. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting and gnarled, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The air smelled damp and earthy, with an undercurrent of something. Stale, like the air hadn't moved in years. I don't know how far I walked, but eventually, the lights stopped moving. They hovered in the air in front of me, forming a small circle. I stepped closer, squinting to see through the darkness, and that's when I noticed the clearing. It wasn't large, maybe 10 feet across, but it was unnatural. The ground was bare, no grass, no leaves, just exposed dirt. And in the center of the clearing, there was something wrong. I couldn't make sense of it at first. It looked like a rock, or maybe a tree stump, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was neither. It was an object, old and weathered, half buried in the ground. The lights danced around it, their glow illuminating strange carvings etched into the surface. Symbols I didn't recognize, patterns that seemed to twist and move as I stared at them. A wave of unease washed over me, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't supposed to be here. It didn't belong. I took a step back, my instincts finally kicking in, screaming at me to leave. But just as I turned to head back to camp, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves, but it was there. Words, or at least the echo of them, carried on the wind. I froze, my heart racing, trying to make out what it was saying, but the whisper was just out of reach, like it was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The lights flickered again, and I felt something shift in the air, like the very atmosphere was changing around me. I turned back to the object in the clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. The carvings were glowing. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. I turned and ran. the whispers growing louder in my ears, the lights flashing wildly around me as I sprinted through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, not caring about the branches that scratched at my skin. All I could think about was getting away from those lights, away from whatever I'd seen in that clearing. When I finally burst back into the campsite, Jake and Emily were standing by the fire, their faces pale with worry. "What happened?" Jake asked, his voice tight. "What did you see?" I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. "We need to go. Now." Emily frowned, glancing toward the trees. "What do you mean? What's out there?" I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't have the words to describe what I'd seen, what I'd felt. All I knew was that we couldn't stay here. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to leave." Jake and Emily exchanged a worried look, but they didn't argue. We packed up our gear in record time, the fire still smoldering as we grabbed our bags and headed back toward the trail. The woods were dark, oppressive, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. As we hiked back to the car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the lights following us, but they never appeared. The forest remained silent, the only sound the crunch of our boots on the dirt path. By the time we reached the car, the first hints of dawn were starting to break through the trees, casting the woods in a pale, gray light. We threw our gear in the trunk and piled into the car, not saying a word until we were miles down the road, leaving the forest behind us. I still don't know what those lights were. I don't know what I found in that clearing, or what the carvings meant. But I do know one thing. Something in those woods didn't want us there, and I'm never going back to find out what it was. The woods can be peaceful, a place to escape, to disconnect from the world. But sometimes they hold secrets, things that you're not supposed to see. And once you've seen them, there's no forgetting. Have you ever driven through a tunnel and felt that momentary chill? Like the world outside has disappeared and all that exists is the echo of your tires on the road and the dim lights overhead? It's unsettling. How a simple stretch of road can feel so different when it's swallowed by rock and darkness. That's how it started for me. Just a drive through an old highway tunnel late at night. The kind of road you don't think twice about until something makes you realize how alone you are. I was on my way back from a weekend visiting some old friends, taking a scenic route through the mountains to avoid the usual traffic. It was the kind of trip where the miles just melted away, the open road, windows down, music low. It was the perfect way to unwind after a long weekend. By the time I reached the tunnel, it was already late. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the sky a deep velvet black, with only the moon and my headlights cutting through the night. The tunnel came up unexpectedly, a dark mouth carved into the side of the mountain, framed by weathered concrete and worn-out road signs. I'd been through it before during the day, but at night it felt different, hollow, like stepping into a cave that swallowed the world behind you. As I entered the tunnel, the radio cut out, leaving only the sound of the car and the rhythmic thumping of my tires on the uneven pavement. The walls of the tunnel were streaked with years of grime, the lights dim and flickering as if they could go out at any moment. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and I told myself it was just the usual tunnel unease, nothing to worry about. But a few hundred feet in, I started to notice something odd. There was a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, one of those moments when your tired brain starts playing games with shadows and distance. The tunnel was long, and the light at the end was faint, but there was definitely someone standing there. They were facing me, still as a statue, almost too still. I slowed down, my heart giving a little kick of unease. What was someone doing in the middle of a highway tunnel, in the dead of night? The closer I got, the more certain I was that it wasn't just my imagination. It was definitely a person, standing dead center, like they were waiting for something. I thought about stopping, maybe backing up and taking another route. but the tunnel was too narrow to turn around, and the idea of reversing all the way out didn't sit right with me either. So I did the only thing that seemed reasonable at the time. I kept going, hoping that when I got close enough, they'd move, or I'd see it was just some shadowy shape that looked human. But as I approached, they didn't move. The figure remained motionless, standing perfectly still, facing my car, their face obscured by the shadows of the tunnel. My foot hovered over the brake, my pulse racing. I couldn't make out any details. Their clothes, their face. It was like they were swallowed by the darkness, a silhouette against the faint glow of the tunnel's exit. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. As my car inched closer, I heard a sound, thumping. It started soft, almost rhythmic, like something hitting the roof of the car. I slowed down even more, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound wasn't coming from the engine or the tires. It was coming from above me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, but the back of the tunnel was just a black void, nothing there. The thumping continued, growing louder, more deliberate. Someone, or something, was on top of the car. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the concrete as the car came to a jerking halt. The figure at the end of the tunnel remained frozen, still watching me, or at least, I felt like they were. The thumping stopped as soon as the car did, and for a few long, terrifying moments, there was nothing but silence. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't dare look up. I didn't want to know what was up there. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. Should I get out? Should I drive forward and just get out of this tunnel as fast as possible? But every instinct in my body screamed at me not to move, not to even breathe too loudly. And then, just as suddenly as the thumping had started, it came again, this time harder, more insistent. The roof of the car groaned under the pressure, like something heavy was pressing down on it. I couldn't take it anymore. I hit the gas, flooring it, my car lurching forward as I sped toward the end of the tunnel. The figure remained still, but just as I was about to pass them, they stepped to the side, melting into the shadows of the tunnel wall as if they'd never been there at all. I shot out of the tunnel, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The thumping stopped the moment I exited the tunnel, replaced by the normal sounds of the road and the rush of wind as my car sped down the highway. I drove for miles without stopping. The image of that figure burned into my mind, the echo of the thumping still ringing in my ears. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me, but the road behind me remained empty. Eventually, I pulled over at a gas station just off the highway, the fluorescent lights glaring and too bright after the dark stretch of road. My hands were still shaking as I stepped out of the car, my legs wobbly, my breath still ragged. I circled around to the back of the car, dread twisting in my stomach as I raised my eyes to the roof. There were dense, small, circular impressions, like someone had been pounding on the metal with their fists. They weren't deep, but they were unmistakable. Someone, or something, had been up there. I didn't wait to figure it out. I got back into the car and drove the rest of the way home, refusing to look back at the tunnel or the road behind me. It wasn't until I was safely in my driveway, the engine off and the house lights shining warmly through the windows, that I allowed myself to breathe again. I never took that road again. In fact, I made a point to avoid tunnels whenever I could after that. There was something about that one, about the figure, the thumping, the way the air felt so heavy and thick inside, that I couldn't shake. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the figure was just a drifter, someone passing through, and the noise on the roof was some loose debris that had fallen from the tunnel ceiling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. It wasn't just a coincidence. Whatever I'd seen, and whatever had been on my car, wasn't something you could explain away that easily. Some places are just wrong. You can feel it in your bones. That sense of dread that creeps up on you when the world feels just a little too quiet, a little too still. And that tunnel, it was one of those places. I still think about it sometimes, Late at night when the world is quiet, and I can hear the faint hum of the highway in the distance, I think about that figure standing in the middle of the road, watching, waiting. I wonder if they're still there, waiting for someone else to come through, someone else to stop and listen to the thumping on the roof. I wonder what would have happened if I'd stopped for good, if I'd gotten out of the car, looked up, and seen what was waiting for me. But I didn't, and I don't plan to find out. Tunnels are supposed to be a passage, a way to get through the dark and into the light on the other side. But sometimes, there's more than just darkness waiting for you in the middle, and sometimes, you're lucky enough to make it out. It's funny how the most ordinary places can suddenly feel strange. A small-town diner is supposed to be comforting, familiar, filled with the smells of coffee and frying bacon, the hum of conversation, and the clatter of dishes. I'd stopped in dozens of diners just like it on road trips, but that night, something about this one felt different. I'd been driving for hours, the kind of long-haul drive where the road stretches out forever in front of you, and I was exhausted. When I saw the neon "Open 24 Hours" sign flickering in the distance, it seemed like a welcome break from the monotony of the highway. I pulled into the gravel lot, parking in one of the few spaces out front. The diner sat alone on the side of the road, surrounded by nothing but open fields and the distant outline of trees. No other cars, no sign of life except for the dim glow from inside. It was quiet, too quiet, but I told myself it was late, and I was probably just overthinking it. The door chimed as I stepped inside, and the warm, greasy smell of fried food hit me immediately. It should have been comforting, familiar, but instead, it felt off. The diner was nearly empty, just a waitress leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone, and a man sitting in one of the booths by the window. His back was to me, and he was hunched over, like he'd been there for hours. The waitress barely glanced up as I walked in. She mumbled something that I didn't quite catch, and I slid into a booth near the middle of the room. My hands felt clammy, and I rubbed them together, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me the moment I'd stepped through the door. I told myself it was nothing. I was just tired, hungry, and my mind was playing tricks on me. After a few minutes, the waitress wandered over, still scrolling on her phone, barely acknowledging me as she took my order. A coffee and a grilled cheese, simple enough. She scribbled it down without looking at me and shuffled back to the counter. I leaned back in the booth, staring out the window at the empty highway. The light from the neon sign flickered faintly against the glass, casting a dim glow across the diner. I could see my car parked outside, the only one in the lot, the gravel lot empty under the moonlight. But it wasn't the view that was bothering me. It was the man sitting in the booth across from me. He hadn't moved since I walked in. He just sat there, hunched over his table, staring down at something I couldn't see. From where I was sitting, I couldn't make out much, just the back of his head, a worn-out jacket, and the way his shoulders sagged like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. I told myself not to stare. It wasn't unusual to see someone alone in a diner at this hour. Maybe he was just passing through, like me. But there was something about him that made my skin crawl. The waitress brought my coffee and sandwich, setting them down with a careless clatter, and walked back to her station. I took a sip, the warmth of the coffee doing little to ease the chill that had settled in my bones. As I ate, I kept stealing glances at the man. He hadn't touched his food, if he even had any. His plate sat in front of him, untouched, and he didn't move, didn't shift in his seat, didn't do anything except sit there. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, or someone. My nerves were on edge now. Every creak of the diner's old floor, every flicker of the lights, every clink of a dish felt louder than it should. I tried to focus on my sandwich, but my appetite had disappeared. The air in the diner felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. And then, the man moved. It was subtle, just a small shift in his posture, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. He straightened slightly, his hands resting on the table, and for a moment, I thought he was going to stand up. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring ahead, as if he was waiting for a signal. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave. The food, the coffee, none of it mattered. I needed to be back on the road, away from whatever strange atmosphere had settled over this place. I stood up, my movements stiff and awkward, trying not to draw attention to myself as I pulled out my wallet. I left a few bills on the table and grabbed my jacket, avoiding eye contact with the waitress as I headed for the door. But just as my hand touched the doorknob, I heard it, the scrape of the man's chair against the floor. I froze, my heart racing. He was standing up. I could feel it. I could hear the soft shuffle of his feet as he turned, his movements slow and deliberate. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what I knew was coming, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head, just enough to catch a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye. He was facing me now. I couldn't make out his face. Not really. The lights in the diner seemed to flicker and dim, casting strange shadows across his features. But there was something in the way he stood, the way his head tilted ever so slightly, that made my skin crawl. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used in a long time. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hand tightened around the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it, couldn't force myself to leave. The man took a step toward me, slow and deliberate, his footsteps eerily quiet on the old diner floor. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my entire body tensing as I braced myself for what? I didn't know. I glanced at the waitress, hoping for some kind of intervention, but she was still by the counter, staring at her phone like nothing was happening, like she hadn't heard a thing. Another step. Closer now. I could feel the man's presence, heavy and suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. My pulse raced, and I felt sweat bead on my forehead. I had to move. I had to get out. Somehow, I found the strength to twist the doorknob and pull the door open. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face, and I stumbled out into the gravel lot, gasping for breath. The door closed behind me with a soft thud, the chime echoing in the quiet night. I hurried to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I glanced back at the diner, half expecting to see the man standing in the window watching me. But he wasn't. The diner was as still as it had been when I first walked in. The neon sign flickered faintly, casting a pale glow over the empty lot. I could see the waitress inside, still scrolling on her phone, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just fled in a panic. I got in the car, locking the doors behind me, and started the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the empty road ahead. I didn't wait. I pulled out of the lot, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away from the diner. As I drove, the tension slowly began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of confusion. What had just happened? Who was that man? And why had I been so terrified? I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the diner fading into the distance, but all I saw was darkness. The road stretched out behind me, empty and silent. No sign of the diner or the neon lights. It was like it had never been there at all. There are places out on the road that don't show up on any map. Places that you stumble upon by accident, only to realize too late that they're not meant to be found. That diner was one of those places, and I hope I never find it again. There's a strange kind of silence that only comes with being out on the water at night. Not the peaceful kind like you'd expect, but a silence that presses in on you, makes the world feel too empty, too still. That's the kind of silence I found myself in the night I saw the ship. It wasn't supposed to be there. Nothing like that had ever been on the lake before. It was just supposed to be a calm evening. I'd taken my small fishing boat out to the lake, as I often did when I wanted to clear my head. It was a remote spot, tucked away in the woods, with hardly anyone else ever around. A place where I could escape everything for a while. The lake was quiet still, and I'd anchored myself near the middle, where the trees lined the shore like dark sentinels. It was peaceful. At first, I was sitting back in the boat, enjoying the cool night air. The stars reflected on the water like tiny pinpricks of light. Everything was calm. I hadn't caught anything yet, but I wasn't really there to fish. It was more about the solitude, the quiet. But then the fog started to roll in. At first, it was just a light mist, hovering over the surface of the water, something I'd seen plenty of times before. But as I watched, the fog thickened, spreading out over the lake like a blanket. It was strange, though. Unnatural, almost. The sky was clear, no sign of clouds, and yet this fog kept coming, growing denser by the minute until I could barely see the shoreline. I leaned forward in the boat, squinting into the fog, trying to make out anything beyond the thick white haze. It was like the world had vanished, leaving me in a small bubble of visibility. The only sound was the gentle lap of water against the side of the boat, and even that seemed muted, like the fog was swallowing the noise. That's when I saw it. A shape, emerging slowly from the fog. At first, it was just a shadow, something dark and distant, barely visible through the haze. I thought it might have been a trick of the light, maybe a reflection or some odd play of the mist. But as it came closer, the shape grew clearer, more defined. It was a ship, not a boat. A ship, big, old, and looming out of the fog like something from another time. I stared, my heart pounding. There shouldn't have been anything that size on the lake. It was a quiet spot, mostly for small boats and fishing, not the kind of place you'd ever expect to see a ship like this. The wood looked ancient, the hull worn and weathered, like it had been sailing for decades, maybe centuries. The ship moved slowly, cutting through the fog without a sound. No engine, no creaking of wood, nothing but the soft ripple of water as it approached. It wasn't heading directly for me, but it was close enough that I could see every detail. The ragged sails, the ropes hanging loosely, the way the water barely disturbed as it passed. There was something else, too. The deck was empty. I couldn't see a single person on board. No crew, no captain, just an eerie, ghostly silence. The ship glided past me, like it didn't even notice I was there, disappearing back into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. I sat there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. What had I just seen? Where had it come from? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some old ship that had been restored, a historical replica or something. But that didn't explain why it was out here, on this remote lake in the middle of the night. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, but there was no signal. Of course not. There was never any reception this far out. I glanced around, trying to see if there was any sign of the ship, but the fog had swallowed it whole. The lake was quiet again, the surface calm, like nothing had ever been there. I should have left. I should have started the motor and headed back to shore, but something kept me there. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. I wasn't sure, but I found myself sitting back down, staring out at the fog, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The fog still clung to the water, thick and unmoving. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, the shoreline completely hidden from view. The silence pressed in, heavier than before, and then I heard it, a soft, distant creak, like wood bending under pressure. Faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from the fog. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, the unmistakable creak of a ship's hull moving through the water, but I still couldn't see anything. The fog was too thick, too dense. The ship was out there, though. I knew it. And then, From somewhere within the mist, I heard something else. A voice, faint, but clear. Help. It was barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, scanning the water, trying to see where it was coming from. Help. The voice came again, a little louder this time, but still distant, echoing through the fog. I grabbed the oars, my heart racing, and started to row in the direction of the sound. My boat cut through the water, the fog swirling around me as I moved. I didn't know who was out there, or what was going on, but I couldn't just ignore it. Someone needed help. But the further I rowed, the more the fog seemed to thicken. The voice grew fainter, harder to follow, until it was barely a whisper again. Help. I stopped rowing, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The sound had almost completely faded, swallowed by the fog, leaving me alone in the silence once more. And that's when I saw the ship again. It loomed out of the mist, much closer this time, towering over my small boat. I could see the details now, the splintered wood, the tattered sails, the way the ship seemed to glide across the water without making a sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared up at it, my mind racing. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. There were figures on the deck now. I couldn't make out their faces, but they were there. Shadowy figures moving slowly across the deck, their movements unnatural, almost too slow. They didn't seem to notice me, didn't react to my presence at all. They just moved about, as if going through the motions of their tasks. But there was no life in them, no purpose. I wanted to turn back, to row away as fast as I could, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot by fear and curiosity. The ship drifted closer, until it was almost within reach, the shadows on the deck moving like a distant memory. And then, as I watched, the figures stopped. All at once, they turned toward me, slowly, deliberately. I felt my blood run cold. Even though I couldn't see their faces, I could feel their eyes on me, feel the weight of their gaze. My hands tightened around the oars, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. One of the figures stepped forward, moving to the edge of the ship. They raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a plea for help. It was a warning. Leave. The word echoed through the fog, sending a chill down my spine. The figure's arm stayed raised, pointing at me, as the ship began to drift away, disappearing back into the mist. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the oars and rowed as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, the fog swirling around me like a living thing. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept rowing until the shore finally came into view. When I reached the shore, I dragged the boat up onto the bank and collapsed on the grass, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog was still thick over the lake, but the ship was gone. There was no sign of it, no sign of the figures, no sign of anything. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the water, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no explanation, no rational answer. All I knew was that I had seen something that wasn't meant to be seen, and I wasn't going back. The water holds secrets, things hidden beneath the surface that we're not meant to understand. I saw something that night on the lake, something I still can't explain, and even though the ship is gone, I can still hear that voice, whispering through the fog, warning me to stay away. There's something about old houses that makes you feel like you're stepping into someone else's memories. The worn wood floors creak under your feet, the smell of dust and old books lingers in the air, and every corner seems to hold a secret. That's exactly how I felt when I checked into the little bed and breakfast on the edge of town. It was quaint, charming even, with its antique furniture and faded wallpaper. But there was something about it that I couldn't quite put my finger on, something that felt just a little too quiet. I was traveling for work, a few towns over from my usual route, and I decided to stay the night to break up the drive. The bed and breakfast had good reviews, and from the outside it looked inviting. A 2-story Victorian house with a wraparound porch and neatly trimmed hedges. The owner, an older woman named Mrs. Winthrop, welcomed me with a warm smile and a set of old-fashioned brass keys. She showed me to my room on the 2nd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway lined with faded family portraits. "This house has been in my family for generations," she said proudly, as she led me down the hall. "Every piece of furniture, every painting, it's all original. We like to keep things just as they were." There was something in her voice that felt almost rehearsed, like she'd given the same speech to 100 guests before me. I nodded politely, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me the moment I walked in. It was just an old house, I told myself. There was nothing to be uneasy about. My room was cozy enough, a small, tidy space with a 4-poster bed, a wooden dresser, and a window that looked out onto the garden. Mrs. Winthrop gave me the usual rundown of amenities, pointed out the shared bathroom at the end of the hall, and left me to settle in. But as I unpacked my things, I couldn't help but notice the door across the hall from mine. It was closed, tightly shut, with no sign of anyone inside. Unlike the other doors in the house, which were slightly worn from years of use, this one looked different, pristine, almost new. The brass doorknob gleamed, and there wasn't a single scratch or scuff mark on the wood. Curious, I stepped out of my room and took a closer look. There was no nameplate or number on the door, nothing to suggest that it was another guest room. I reached for the knob, my hand hovering over it for a moment before I stopped myself. It felt wrong to just open it, but the door intrigued me. As I stood there, I heard Mrs. Winthrop's voice from downstairs. "Everything all right up there?" she called. I jumped back, my heart racing a little faster than it should have. "Yeah, everything's fine," I shouted back, quickly retreating to my room. I tried to push the strange door out of my mind, telling myself that it was probably just a storage closet or an unused room. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The house was old, creaky, and every sound seemed to echo down the hallway. But there was something about the silence that unnerved me. I had the sense that something, or someone, was just beyond that door, waiting. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, the quiet of the house pressing down on me. Finally, unable to sleep, I got up and decided to take a walk around the house. Maybe I could shake off the weird feeling if I moved around a bit. I crept down the hallway, careful not to make too much noise. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the lace curtains in the hallway. As I passed the door again, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob once more. I couldn't explain it, but something about that door called to me. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and tried the knob. It didn't budge. Locked. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. I wasn't sure what I expected, but the locked door only deepened my curiosity. Why would Mrs. Winthrop keep this one room locked when the rest of the house was open to guests? I tried to shake it off, heading downstairs to the small sitting area by the fireplace. The house was quiet, the shadows long and dark, and the only sound was the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. I sat there for a while, staring into the cold fireplace, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I heard it, a faint noise, coming from upstairs. At first I thought I was imagining it, a soft creaking, like someone moving around in one of the rooms. But the house was empty, except for me and Mrs. Winthrop, and her room was downstairs. The noise came again, this time louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door opening. My heart leapt into my throat. I sat frozen, listening, but the house had fallen silent again. Slowly, I stood up, and made my way back to the staircase, peering up into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the long, empty hallway. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just the house settling, just the old wood groaning under the weight of time. But as I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door across from my room, the one that had been locked, was open. Just a crack, but enough to see inside. I stared at it, my pulse racing, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around and go back to my room. But I couldn't. I had to know what was in there. I crept forward, my footsteps barely making a sound on the old wood floor. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a room that looked perfectly ordinary. It was just like the other guest rooms in the house: a bed, a dresser, a small window overlooking the garden. There was nothing strange about it. No eerie decorations, no secret passageways, nothing to explain why the door had been locked. But as I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the house, and it smelled faintly of something old, something musty, like the scent of a room that hadn't been used in years. I turned to leave, my curiosity satisfied, when something caught my eye. There, on the bed, was a small, leather-bound journal. I hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to stop me, but the house was silent. Slowly, I walked over to the bed and picked up the journal, my fingers brushing against the worn leather. The pages were yellowed with age, and as I flipped through them, I realized it was a guest book, full of handwritten entries from people who had stayed at the bed and breakfast over the years. But the last entry stopped me cold. It was dated nearly 20 years ago. June 14th. I'm staying in the locked room tonight. I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong here. Mrs. Winthrop says the room has always been this way, but I don't believe her. I hear things at night. Footsteps, whispers. I'm going to find out what's behind that door. If I don't... The entry stopped there, the rest of the page blank. I stared at the journal, my heart racing. What had happened to the person who wrote that? Why had they been staying in the locked room? And why had Mrs. Winthrop lied about it? Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. A soft creak, like someone stepping into the room. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the open door, leading out into the dark hallway. I didn't wait to find out what was going on. I dropped the journal and rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I bolted back to my own room, locking the door and throwing myself onto the bed. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, listening to every creak, every whisper of the old house, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house remained silent. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left without saying a word to Mrs. Winthrop. I didn't want to ask her about the journal or the room. I didn't want to know what had happened to the guest who wrote that last entry. I just wanted to leave. There are places in this world that hold secrets, places that have been around for too long, where the past clings to the walls like a shadow. That bed and breakfast was one of those places. And while I don't know what happened in that locked room, I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to find out. There's a certain kind of loneliness you feel when you're deep in the woods, miles away from anyone or anything familiar. It's a strange, almost peaceful kind of isolation, until it's not. Until you realize that the world is a lot bigger and darker than you'd ever imagined, and there's no one around to help if something goes wrong. That's how I felt when I went hiking on that trail last summer. Alone, surrounded by trees that stretched endlessly in every direction. The kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. But as I would soon learn, I wasn't alone. It started as a weekend trip, just something to get me out of the city for a few days. I'd been feeling restless, caught up in the usual grind of work and stress. and a solo hike seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I'd picked a trail that wasn't too far from where I lived, a state park a few hours away, known for its rugged beauty and, more importantly, its lack of crowds. It was exactly what I needed. The drive out was uneventful, and by the time I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already high in the sky. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies, a light breeze, and the kind of crisp air that you only get in the mountains. I packed my gear, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and set off, eager to leave the noise and chaos of the world behind me. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense forests and rocky outcrops, with the occasional glimpse of a distant mountain peak. For the first few hours, I didn't see another soul, and that was exactly how I liked it. Just me, the trail, and the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel. It was peaceful, the kind of solitude that feels right. But as the day wore on, I started to notice something strange. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. The way the trees seemed to grow closer together, the way the air felt heavier, thicker, the deeper I went. The trail itself seemed to narrow, the path growing less defined as if fewer people had walked it recently. And then there was the silence. The forest had been full of sounds earlier, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. But now it felt dead. No birds, no animals, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. I pushed those thoughts aside, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I was in the middle of the woods, after all. Of course, it was quiet. That's what I wanted, wasn't it? I checked my map and decided to press on. There was a small campsite about 5 miles ahead, and I figured I'd stop there for the night. The trail was supposed to loop back toward the main park entrance the next day, and I could head back to my car after a good night's rest. But as I continued, the unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trail felt different somehow, like it wasn't the same path I'd been walking on earlier. The trees seemed taller, darker, and the undergrowth was thicker, more tangled. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving between the trees, or a flash of light that disappeared as soon as I turned my head. And then, I found the backpack. It was sitting just off the trail, half hidden by some ferns. At first, I thought it might have been left behind by another hiker, maybe someone who had gone off the path and forgotten it. But as I approached, I realized that the backpack was old, worn and weathered like it had been there for a long time. I knelt down, inspecting it. The fabric was torn in places, and the zippers were rusted shut. There was a layer of dirt and leaves covering it, as if it had been sitting there for months, maybe even years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened one of the pockets, pulling out a faded map of the park. And then, tucked inside one of the side pockets, I found a journal. The cover was battered, the pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open, my fingers brushing over the neat, handwritten entries. It was a hiker's log, filled with notes about the trail, the wildlife, the scenery. But the last few entries were different. They were frantic, scrawled in shaky handwriting, the words barely legible. Something is following me. I stared at the page, my heart skipping a beat. I keep hearing footsteps behind me, but when I turn around, there's no one there. The entries grew more frantic as they went on. I don't know how I got here. This isn't the same trail. It keeps changing. I tried to turn back, but the way is blocked. There are no signs anymore. I don't know where I am. The last entry was just a single sentence, written in shaky, uneven letters. It's watching me. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. My first instinct was to leave, just drop the journal, turn around and get the hell out of there. But when I looked up, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The trail was gone. The path I'd been walking on, the one that had been so clear just minutes ago, had disappeared. In its place was a tangled mess of trees and undergrowth, the way forward completely obscured. I stood up, panic rising in my chest, and turned around to retrace my steps. But the trail behind me had vanished too. I was completely surrounded by trees, no sign of the path I'd been following for hours. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to calm myself. This was just a trick of the woods, I told myself. I'd wandered off the trail without realizing it. If I just stayed calm, I could find my way back. But as I stood there, trying to get my bearings, I heard it. A soft rustling sound coming from the trees behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps, moving slowly through the undergrowth. My mind raced. It could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or a rabbit. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too human. I turned around, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. Just the same endless stretch of forest, the same oppressive silence. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and then I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, watching me from the edge of the forest. I blinked, and they were gone. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and started moving, my mind screaming at me to get away from whatever was out there. I didn't know where I was going, just away, deeper into the woods, my feet crunching on the leaves as I ran. The footsteps followed, growing louder, closer, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there, was matching my pace. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps, until the trees around me blurred together in a dizzying haze of green and brown. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. And then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, the trail reappeared. I stumbled onto the path, nearly collapsing in relief. The familiar dirt trail stretched out in front of me, leading back toward the campsite I'd been heading for. I didn't stop to question it. I didn't care how or why the trail had returned. I just kept moving, my feet carrying me forward as fast as they could. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the ground. The small clearing was empty, the fire pit cold, but I didn't care. I dropped my pack and collapsed onto the ground, my heart still racing. I never found out what happened to the person who wrote that journal, or how their backpack had ended up there. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't sticking around to find out. The next morning, I packed up and left, hiking back to the trailhead as fast as I could. The woods seemed different in the daylight, less threatening, more familiar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from the shadows. I haven't been back to that trail since. I don't plan to. The woods can be beautiful, peaceful even, but there are some places where you're not supposed to go. Some trails that lead you somewhere you're not meant to find. And once you've seen what's out there, you can't unsee it. You never really understand what it means to be alone until you're in a place where no one can reach you. I thought I knew solitude. I'd always liked the idea of being somewhere remote, far away from the noise and clutter of everyday life. So when a friend offered me their family's cabin for a weekend, I jumped at the chance. I didn't think twice. A cabin, tucked away in the mountains, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just me and the quiet. That was exactly what I needed. The drive up was long but beautiful, the road winding through dense forests, the trees growing taller and thicker the further I went. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin itself was small and rustic, perched on the edge of a ridge with a breathtaking view of the valley below. There was a faint smell of pine in the air, and the soft sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing I could hear. It felt like I'd stepped into another world, one far removed from the constant noise of the city. I unpacked quickly, settling into the cabin's cozy, worn interior. The place had everything I needed: a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a bedroom upstairs. There was even an old bookshelf stocked with novels that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Perfect, I thought. No distractions, no people, just a weekend to myself. That first evening passed quietly. I cooked dinner, read by the fire, and let the silence of the cabin wrap around me like a warm blanket. The stillness felt good. It felt peaceful. But as the night wore on, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before, like the cabin was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the natural unease of being in a new place. After all, I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. Back home, there was always noise, traffic, neighbors, the hum of the city. Here, there was nothing. By the time I climbed into bed, the wind outside had picked up, howling softly as it rattled the old wooden shutters. The room was dark, save for the faint light of the moon filtering through the window. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, feeling oddly unsettled, though I couldn't quite explain why. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the unfamiliar silence. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I started to hear something else. At first, I thought it was part of the wind, a faint creaking sound that seemed to come from the walls of the cabin. Old wood settling, I figured. Nothing to worry about. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from upstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There shouldn't have been anything up there. The only room upstairs was the small bedroom I was in, and the attic door had been locked when I checked earlier. I lay there, listening to the creaking sound, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But then, there was a soft thud, like something had moved. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The cabin was small enough that I could hear every little noise, every gust of wind, but this was different. This was too deliberate. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. There was no response, just the wind and the faint creaking above me. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the rising sense of unease in my chest. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had found its way into the attic. That would explain the noise. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and climbed out of bed, the wooden floorboards cold under my feet. The cabin creaked as I walked across the room, my footsteps sounding impossibly loud in the silence. I stood at the base of the stairs, staring up into the darkness, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. The attic door was still closed, but the creaking sound was louder now, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the railing tightly. The old wood groaned under my weight, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. When I reached the top, I stopped in front of the attic door, my flashlight flickering slightly as I aimed it at the handle. The door was still locked, but the sound, whatever it was definitely coming from inside. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around, go back downstairs, and lock myself in the bedroom, but I couldn't. I had to know what was making that noise. I took a deep breath and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading up into the attic. The air was colder here, musty and stale, and my flashlight flickered again as I stepped forward. The attic was small and cluttered with old furniture, an antique rocking chair, a few boxes, and a large wooden trunk pushed against the far wall. The creaking sound had stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. I shone the flashlight around the room, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the dust-covered furniture and the faint smell of mildew. I stepped further into the attic, my heart still pounding. The beam of my flashlight landed on the rocking chair, and for a moment I thought I saw it move. Just the slightest shift, like someone had been sitting in it. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. And then, the creaking started again. It was louder now, coming from the far corner of the attic behind the wooden trunk. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I aimed the flashlight into the shadows. That's when I saw it. A shadow. Not just any shadow, but one that moved, slowly, deliberately, like it was alive. It shifted in the darkness, almost human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Its edges were too sharp, its movements too smooth, like it was something trying to mimic a person. I stumbled back, my heart racing, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The shadow seemed to follow me, sliding across the floor as if it were attached to me, like it was part of the darkness itself. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and bolted down the stairs, my feet slipping on the old wooden steps as I raced back into the bedroom. I slammed the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I leaned against it, trying to calm my pounding heart. The cabin was silent again. No creaking, no footsteps, just the wind howling softly outside. I stayed in the bedroom for the rest of the night, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hands. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow moving in the attic, felt its presence in the darkness, like it was still watching me. When the first light of dawn broke through the window, I packed my things and left the cabin without a second thought. I didn't care that I hadn't spent the whole weekend there. I didn't care that I hadn't gotten the peace and quiet I'd been looking for. All I cared about was getting as far away from that place as possible. I never told my friend about what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I wasn't sure they'd believe me anyway. But I know what I saw that night. And I know that whatever was in that attic wasn't something I was supposed to see. I've thought about it a lot since then, replayed the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. But there's no explanation, no rational reason for what happened. The cabin might still be there, quiet and empty, waiting for the next person to come along. But I won't be one of them. Solitude is a strange thing. It can be peaceful, comforting even. But sometimes, when you're truly alone, you realize just how unsettling it can be, especially when you're not really alone after all. You know that eerie feeling you get when a place that should be busy is completely deserted, like something's just off. That's exactly how I felt the moment I pulled into the abandoned rest stop off Route 78. It wasn't even that late, just past sunset, but the place was completely empty. No cars, no lights, just silence. It felt like stepping into a forgotten corner of the world, and for a moment, I hesitated, wondering if I should have just kept driving. I'd been on the road for hours, making my way back home after visiting family out of state. The drive had been uneventful, the same stretches of highway, the same rest stops, until I hit this one. I hadn't meant to stop, but I'd missed the last gas station, and my stomach was growling something fierce. The GPS had pointed out a rest area a couple of miles up, and I figured I'd grab a quick snack from the vending machine and stretch my legs. When I pulled in, though, something felt wrong. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, like it hadn't been maintained in years. The building itself was dark, the windows covered in grime, and the once bright rest stop sign was barely legible, its paint peeling away. I'd expected some rundown spots on this road, but this place felt more like a relic than a working rest area. Still, I figured it was just one of those old stops that time forgot, so I parked near the building and got out of the car. The air was cool, with the scent of pine hanging in the breeze. Aside from the faint rustling of leaves, there was no sound at all. I walked over to the vending machine, which looked just as neglected as the rest of the place. The glass was fogged over, and the buttons were grimy, but it was still plugged in, the hum of the compressor, the only sign of life in this forgotten stop. I dug some change out of my pocket, dropped it in, and hit the button for a pack of chips. For a moment, nothing happened. I banged on the side of the machine, annoyed, when suddenly, the chips dropped with a loud clunk, making me jump. I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head at my own nerves. It was just an old vending machine, and I was just tired. Nothing to worry about. As I grabbed my chips, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, barely audible over the soft hum of the machine, but it was there, a shuffling sound, coming from somewhere near the rest stop building. I turned, squinting into the dim light of dusk, but I didn't see anyone. The place was empty. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer, just the wind, stirring the trees and rustling the weeds along the edge of the lot. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden wave of unease creeping up my spine. I was overreacting, I told myself. This was just an old, run-down rest stop. Maybe some animal had wandered close, or maybe it was nothing at all. I decided to check out the restrooms before getting back on the road. After all, it was a long stretch ahead, and I wasn't sure when I'd get another chance. The bathroom door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Inside, the lights flickered weakly, casting strange shadows across the cracked tiles and water-stained walls. It smelled damp and musty, the kind of smell you'd expect from a place that hadn't been cleaned in a long time. I quickly took care of business, eager to get back on the road, but as I washed my hands, I heard the noise again. This time, it was closer, a soft scraping, like something being dragged along the ground. My heart skipped a beat as I turned off the faucet and stood perfectly still, listening. The noise stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. But then, I heard it again, this time from outside the bathroom. Someone, or something, was out there. I grabbed my bag and stepped toward the door, trying to keep my breathing steady. I pushed it open just enough to peer outside, but the lot was empty. The sky had darkened, and the only light came from the faint glow of my car's headlights. I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the shadows. The rest stop building loomed in the dark, its broken windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. I walked quickly to my car, my footsteps echoing across the empty lot. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As I reached the car, I heard it again, the scraping sound, closer this time, right behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the empty parking lot, the overgrown weeds, and the darkened rest stop. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the lot, near the edge of the woods, something moved. A shadow, shifting between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but it was too tall, too human. It stood just beyond the reach of the light, its form barely visible in the gathering darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. The figure remained still, its face hidden in shadow. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get in the car and leave. Whatever, or whoever that was, I didn't want to find out. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and quickly unlocked the door. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart racing, staring at the figure in the distance. It still hadn't moved. It was just standing there, watching me, like it had all the time in the world. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and threw it into reverse. As I backed out of the parking spot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the lot. There was no sign of it, no movement, no shadow, nothing. It had just disappeared. I didn't waste any more time. I pulled out of the lot and sped down the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My heart was still racing, my mind reeling from what I'd just seen, or what I thought I'd seen. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following me down the road. But the highway remained empty, the dark trees rushing by in the glow of my headlights. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I finally let myself relax. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking, and sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it all in my head? Had I imagined the figure, the noises? The rest stop had been strange, sure, but could it really have been more than just an old, forgotten place? I got out of the car, stretched my legs, and walked over to the gas station attendant. He was an older man, leaning against the counter with a bored expression. "Hey," I said, my voice still shaky. "Do you know anything about that rest stop back on Route 78? The one that looks abandoned?" The man raised an eyebrow, his expression turning serious. "You stopped there?" "Yeah," I said, frowning. "It seemed empty, but—" "You shouldn't have done that," he interrupted, shaking his head. "That place hasn't been open in years. Folks around here don't stop there, not anymore." I stared at him, my stomach tightening. "What do you mean?" The man leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "There's something wrong with that place. People who stop there, they say they see things, hear things, things that aren't supposed to be there." A chill ran down my spine. "Like what?" He shrugged, but his expression was grave. "Depends on who you ask, but most people just don't come back." I felt my blood run cold. I hadn't imagined it. That figure, that presence I'd felt. It was real. I thanked the man, got back in my car, and drove off without looking back. I didn't want to know any more about that place. Whatever had been out there, watching me, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. There are places along the road that aren't meant to be stopped at. Places that hold on to something darker, something that waits in the shadows for the next person to come along. That rest stop, it's one of those places, and I'll never stop there again. I've never been the kind of person to get creeped out by houses. They're just buildings, right? Brick and wood, walls and windows. Nothing special, nothing sinister. But the house I stayed in last fall, something about it was different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling like the house itself was watching me. And then I saw the man in the window, and everything changed. It started when my friend Sarah asked if I could house sit for a weekend. She and her husband were heading out of town, and they didn't want to leave their place unattended. It was an old house, big and kind of isolated, set back from the road with a sprawling yard and thick trees surrounding the property. I didn't mind. It sounded like a nice getaway, a chance to spend a couple of quiet nights reading and relaxing. When I arrived, the house looked just like I'd remembered it from the last time I visited. Tall, with narrow windows that seemed to go on forever, and a big wraparound porch that creaked underfoot. The air was cool, with the crisp smell of fall in the breeze, and the leaves had started to turn, painting the trees in shades of red and orange. Sarah showed me around, reminding me of the basic house rules. Don't let the cat outside, water the plants, and make sure the back door stays locked because sometimes it sticks. Simple enough. She and her husband left just before sunset, leaving me alone in the big, quiet house. I settled in easily, making myself some tea and curling up on the couch with a book. The place was cozy, filled with old furniture and soft, warm lighting. Everything felt calm, peaceful. But as the evening wore on, I started to notice something strange. The house had a lot of windows, big ones, in every room, letting in plenty of natural light during the day. But at night, those windows felt different. They were dark, almost too dark, like they absorbed all the light from the room. I couldn't see anything beyond them, just my own reflection staring back at me. And every time I glanced up from my book, I had the oddest feeling that something was looking in. I shook it off. It was just the unfamiliarity of the place, I told myself. Old houses always felt a little eerie when you were alone. I tried to focus on my book, but that nagging feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. After a while, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the lights, double-checked that the back door was locked, and headed upstairs to the guest room. The stairs creaked under my feet, the sound echoing through the empty house. I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was too quiet. The guest room was cozy enough. A comfortable bed, a small dresser, and, of course, another big window overlooking the front yard. I pulled the curtains shut, trying to block out the sense of unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination getting the best of me. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't fall asleep. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, my mind racing with a vague sense of discomfort. The house creaked and groaned, the old wood settling in the cool night air. Every little noise felt magnified, and I found myself straining to listen for something that wasn't there. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A soft tapping sound. Faint, but unmistakable. I sat up in bed, my heart skipping a beat. The sound came again, this time louder, like someone gently tapping on glass. My eyes flicked toward the window, where the curtains were still drawn, blocking my view of whatever was outside. For a moment, I sat there, frozen, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really heard anything. It was probably just a branch, I thought, or maybe a bird. But as I listened, the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and slowly got out of bed. The room felt colder now, the air heavy with the weight of something I couldn't quite name. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the curtain, before finally pulling it back. And that's when I saw him, a man, standing just outside the window, his face inches from the glass. I gasped, stumbling back in shock. He was standing perfectly still, his expression blank, his eyes wide and staring straight at me. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me through the window. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Who was he? How had he gotten there? The house was in the middle of nowhere, and the yard was fenced in. There was no way someone could have just wandered up to the window. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest, and when I looked again, he was gone. The window was empty, no sign of anyone outside, just the dark, still night beyond the glass. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Had I imagined it? Had it been some kind of trick of the light? My mind was reeling, but I knew one thing for sure. I hadn't imagined the tapping. I rushed downstairs, checking the front door, the back door, and every window I could find. Everything was locked, just as I'd left it. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the yard, no movement in the shadows. The man, if he'd even been real, was gone. But the unease didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the image of his face, those wide, staring eyes, the way he'd stood so still, so close to the glass. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe I'd been half asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But I didn't believe it. I spent the rest of the night downstairs on the couch, the lights on, my eyes flicking to the windows every few minutes. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The next morning, I was exhausted, but the house felt normal again. The sunlight streaming through the windows made everything seem less menacing, and I started to doubt what I'd seen the night before. Maybe it really had been a dream, or maybe I was just overtired. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, but when I stepped outside to check the yard, my heart sank. There, in the soft dirt beneath the guest room window, were footprints. Clear, unmistakable footprints, leading right up to the window and then stopping. No trail leading away, no signs of someone walking off into the distance. Just a pair of footprints, as if the man had appeared out of nowhere, stood there and vanished. I stared at them, my stomach twisting with dread. It wasn't a dream. He had been there, standing outside my window, watching me in the middle of the night. I packed my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I threw my clothes into my bag. I didn't care that Sarah wouldn't be back until the evening. I wasn't staying in that house another minute. Before I left, I texted her, telling her about the footprints and the man I'd seen outside the window. She didn't respond right away, but as I drove down the long, winding road away from the house, my phone buzzed with a message. "That's impossible," Sarah wrote. "There's no way someone could have been at the window." I frowned, my heart still racing. I knew what I'd seen. Then another message came through. "The guest room window is on the second floor." Some houses have a way of holding on to things, memories, people, even shadows. I don't know who that man was or why he appeared at the window, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never be house sitting there again. There's something about driving alone at night that always feels a little unsettling. The road stretches out endlessly in front of you, dark and empty, with only the faint glow of your headlights cutting through the black. I've done enough solo road trips to know how to shake off that uneasy feeling, but that night was different. That night, no matter how many times I told myself I was just imagining things, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I'd been driving for hours, heading home from a work trip that had dragged on longer than expected. It was already late, and I still had a few hours to go. The highway was nearly deserted, just me, the occasional passing car, and the hum of the engine. I had the radio on low, more for company than anything else, but it wasn't doing much to calm my nerves. The night was thick with fog, the kind that makes everything outside your car feel distant and disconnected. The road ahead was barely visible, swallowed up by the swirling mist, and the trees lining the highway seemed to loom closer with each mile. I focused on the road, trying to ignore the creeping sense of isolation that hung in the air. That's when my phone rang. The sudden sound startled me. I glanced down at the screen, expecting to see my wife's name or maybe a call from work. But the number was unfamiliar. No caller ID, just a long string of numbers that didn't make sense. I hesitated for a moment before answering, figuring it was a wrong number or some kind of telemarketer. "Hello?" I said, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness of the car. There was a pause, long enough to make me wonder if the call had dropped. And then, I heard it. A soft, distant voice. It was faint, barely above a whisper, and I had to strain to make out the words. "Are you alone?" I frowned, glancing at the screen again, my heart skipping a beat. "Excuse me?" The voice didn't answer right away. It was a woman's voice, low and hushed, like she was speaking from far away, and there was a strange crackling sound in the background, like static or wind. "Are you alone?" she repeated, her voice clearer this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. The way she said it, like she already knew the answer, set me on edge. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaky. There was a pause, and then she said, "You should keep driving." I blinked, glancing at the road ahead, my pulse quickening. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" But the line went dead before I could get an answer. I stared at the phone in my hand, the screen showing the call had ended, and for a moment, I just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. Maybe it was a prank, I told myself. Some weirdo who dialed a random number just to mess with me. But it didn't feel like a prank. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, shaking my head and trying to laugh it off. Just some random creep, I thought. No big deal. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself of that, the uneasy feeling in my chest didn't go away. I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than before. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in around the car like a heavy blanket, and the road ahead seemed to disappear into nothingness. The highway was completely empty now, not a single car in sight. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the soft whisper of the tires on the pavement. And then, my phone rang again. I jumped, my heart racing, and grabbed it off the seat. It was the same number, long, unfamiliar, with no caller ID. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the answer button. Everything in me was screaming not to pick up, but I couldn't help it. I had to know who this was. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. The same soft, crackling sound came through the line, and then the woman's voice again. "Don't stop driving." Her tone was calm, almost soothing, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Why are you calling me?" There was a long silence, and for a moment, I thought the call had dropped again, but then she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's following you." My blood ran cold. "What's following me?" I asked, my voice barely steady. The static on the line grew louder, crackling like distant thunder, and her voice was faint now, like she was speaking from miles away. "Don't stop," she said again, and then the call cut off. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with 100 questions and no answers. What the hell was going on? Who was this woman? And how did she know where I was? I glanced at the empty road ahead, the fog so thick now that I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The trees seemed to close in on either side, their dark shapes shifting in the mist. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow. It flickered in my side mirror, just a glimpse, but enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I whipped my head around, scanning the road behind me, but there was nothing there, just the swirling fog and the empty highway. But I knew I'd seen something. Something dark, moving just behind the car, too fast to be human, too big to be an animal. I hit the gas, my heart racing as the car surged forward. The engine roared as I sped down the highway, the trees flashing by in a blur. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The phone rang again, but I didn't answer it this time. I didn't need to. I could feel it now. Something behind me, something following, something that I couldn't see, but knew was there. The fog seemed to close in tighter, the world shrinking around me until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel with no end. The phone kept ringing, over and over, the shrill sound cutting through the roar of the engine. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't stop driving. The minutes dragged on like hours, the empty road stretching endlessly ahead of me. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I didn't know what was following me, or why, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stop. The phone rang again, but this time, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a command. Keep driving. I pressed down harder on the gas, my foot shaking, and the car raced forward, the speedometer climbing higher and higher. The world outside the car was a blur now, the trees and fog blending together into one long, shapeless smear of darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog began to thin. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, as the swirling mist slowly gave way to clear night sky. The trees retreated, the road opened up, and in the distance, I saw the glow of lights, street lights, bright and reassuring, marking the edge of a small town. The phone stopped ringing. I slowed the car, my hands still shaking, and pulled off at the first gas station I saw. My heart was still racing, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened. I parked the car, sitting there for a long moment in the quiet, the sound of the engine ticking as it cooled. I picked up my phone, staring at the screen, no missed calls, no unfamiliar numbers, just silence. Sometimes, the things we can't explain are the ones that haunt us the most. I don't know what was following me that night, and I don't know who that woman on the phone was. But I do know one thing. Whatever it was, it's out there. And if you're ever driving alone at night and your phone rings, you'd better keep driving. You know when you arrive at a place and immediately feel like something's off? That sense that what you're seeing can't possibly be right, even if you can't quite put your finger on why. That's what hit me the second I stepped out of the car and looked at the lake. The thing is, I'd been to this campsite before dozens of times, and there had never been a lake. And yet there it was, calm, dark, and stretching out before me like it had always been there. I was on a weekend camping trip with my friend and Mark. We both needed a break, a couple of days away from the chaos of work and life. The campsite we'd chosen was remote, tucked away in a quiet corner of the woods that not many people knew about. We'd gone there for years, just a patch of forest with a clearing perfect for pitching a tent and a small stream nearby for water. No amenities, no crowds, just the peace and quiet we craved. We'd set out early that morning, eager to leave the city behind. The drive was uneventful, winding through familiar country roads and dense forest, the kind of trip that lulled you into a comfortable rhythm. But as we neared the campsite, things started to feel strange. The trees seemed different, thicker maybe, or older, as if the forest had grown denser since our last trip. And then, when we pulled up to the clearing, there it was, the lake. Mark and I stood there for a moment, just staring at it. He glanced over at me, clearly confused. "Did we take a wrong turn?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. I shook my head. "No. This is the place. I'm sure of it." He frowned, looking out at the water. It was perfectly still, the surface smooth as glass, reflecting the sky above. The trees on the far side of the lake looked impossibly tall, their dark shapes looming over the water like sentinels. The whole scene felt surreal, like something out of a dream. "I don't remember this being here," Mark muttered, more to himself than to me. "Neither do I said, my voice low. "But it's here now." We both stood there for a few more minutes, neither of us saying anything. There was something about the lake that made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. It wasn't just that it hadn't been there before. It was the way it looked. Too perfect, too still, like it didn't belong. Eventually, we decided to set up camp anyway. After all, we'd driven all the way out here, and it wasn't like the lake was going to harm us. We pitched our tent a little way back from the water, in the spot we always used. And soon enough, we were sitting by a small fire, trying to shake off the weirdness of the lake. But that strange feeling didn't go away. As the sun started to set, casting a warm orange glow over the forest, the lake seemed to change. The stillness of the water became unsettling, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The air around us grew colder, even though the fire was burning strong. And every so often, I could have sworn I saw something move beneath the surface of the water, a dark shape, just barely visible before disappearing again. "Do you feel that?" Mark asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I nodded, not needing him to explain. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the strange calm of the lake was starting to mess with my head. We both sat there, staring into the flames, neither of us mentioning the growing unease we felt. I tried to convince myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the lake, just our minds playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't until later, when the fire had died down and the stars were scattered across the sky, that things got worse. We were sitting in the quiet, the only sound the crackling of the last embers when we heard it. A splash. We both froze, our eyes darting to the lake. The surface, which had been smooth and undisturbed all evening, rippled in the moonlight. Something had broken the water. Mark stood up, squinting at the lake. "What was that?" "A fish." I didn't answer. I was staring at the water, my heart racing. The ripple was still there, slowly spreading out across the lake. But there was no sign of what had caused it. And then, just as I was about to brush it off as a fish or some animal, we saw it, ahead. It broke the surface slowly, almost too slowly, as if it had been waiting for us to notice. Pale, with long, wet hair hanging down over its face, the figure seemed to rise out of the water like it was being pulled up by invisible strings. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't swimming or treading water. It was just standing there, in the middle of the lake, its body submerged beneath the surface. "Do you see that?" Mark whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, its face hidden by the curtain of hair, its body still as the water around it. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark didn't argue. We both scrambled to our feet, our hearts pounding as we backed away from the lake. But as we did, the figure started to move. Slowly, it turned its head, as if sensing our fear. And then, with a sudden burst of movement, it started walking toward us. No, not walking, gliding. It didn't disturb the water as it moved, didn't make a sound. It just came closer, its pale face still hidden, its wet hair dripping onto the lake's surface. Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the car. "Come on, let's go." We stumbled through the darkness, barely able to see where we were going. My mind was racing, panic surging through me. I glanced back once, and that's when I saw its eyes. They were wide, almost too wide, and glowing faintly in the moonlight. Empty, like two dark voids staring straight into me. My heart nearly stopped as I realized it was getting closer. Too close. We reached the car, and Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them. I snatched them up, throwing open the driver's side door and jumping in. Mark followed, slamming the door shut behind him just as the figure reached the edge of the lake. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands trembling, and the car roared to life. I threw it into reverse, peeling out of the clearing and onto the narrow dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing at the edge of the lake, watching us. Its eyes glowed faintly in the distance, two pinpricks of light that burned into my mind. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, until the lake and the forest were far behind us. Neither of us said a word for the longest time. We were both too shaken, too terrified to even try to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, Mark broke the silence. "What was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. We never went back to that campsite. I've heard other people talk about lakes that appear out of nowhere, places that shouldn't exist but do, just long enough to trap those unlucky enough to find them. Maybe that's what we stumbled onto that night. Or maybe it was something else, something I can't explain. All I know is that there's something out there, something waiting in the dark waters of a lake that shouldn't be there. And if you ever find yourself camping in a place you thought you knew, and the landscape doesn't look quite right, leave. Don't ask questions, just leave. There are places you drive past 100 times without giving them a second thought, places that blend into the background, unnoticed and unremarkable. But then, one day, something about them feels wrong, different, off in a way that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. That's exactly what happened to me when I pulled into the gas station off Route 22, the one I'd passed countless times before but never stopped at. I wish I hadn't that night. But I was running low on gas, and the next station wasn't for another 50 miles. It was late, close to midnight, and I was the only car on the road. The highway was deserted, just the long stretch of asphalt disappearing into the darkness, with nothing but the occasional streetlight to break up the gloom. When I saw the gas station sign flickering in the distance, I felt a wave of relief. My tank was nearly empty, and the idea of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly appealing. The station itself was small and run down, like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The pumps were old, the paint peeling off them in long strips, and the building looked like it had seen better days. But it was open. The lights were on, a faint glow coming from inside the small convenience store, and a neon sign buzzing in the window read 24 hours. I pulled up to the pump, cut the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. The place was eerily quiet. No cars, no people, just the hum of the neon sign and the faint rustling of the wind in the trees. I shrugged off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine and went to swipe my card at the pump. It didn't work. No surprise there, given how ancient the pump looked. Sighing, I headed toward the store to pay inside. The door jingled as I stepped in, the smell of stale air and old cigarettes hitting me immediately. The store was just as rundown as the outside, with dusty shelves lined with faded snacks and long-expired soda. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering occasionally. There was a guy behind the counter, hunched over a magazine, barely glancing up as I walked in. "Hey," I called out, trying to catch his attention. "Pump 2 isn't taking cards?" He didn't respond at first, just flipped a page in his magazine without looking at me. I frowned, stepping closer. "Hello?" Finally, he glanced up. His eyes were tired, almost blank, like he'd been sitting there for hours without moving. "Pump 2, huh?" he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "Yeah, that one doesn't work too well. Cash only." I nodded, pulling out some bills from my wallet. "Can I get 30 on pump 2 then?" He took the cash, moving slowly, like every action was a chore, and rang me up. As he handed me my receipt, I noticed something odd. His hands were pale, too pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years, and his nails were long, yellowed at the edges. "Thanks," I mumbled, backing away and heading toward the door. As I stepped outside, the uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, really wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker, and the night seemed darker, as if the shadows were closing in around me. I hurried back to the pump, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started filling up the tank, my eyes darting around the empty lot, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the neon sign and the occasional flicker of the overhead lights. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the noise of the pump. It was coming from the woods behind the station. A low, rhythmic rustling, like something moving through the trees. I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right at the edge of the lot. I turned, squinting into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Just the black outline of the trees, the shadows shifting in the dim light. But I knew something was there. I could feel it. The pump clicked, signaling that my tank was full, and I quickly removed the nozzle, my hands shaking. I fumbled with the gas cap, my eyes still scanning the woods, waiting for something, anything, to emerge from the shadows. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was quick, barely a flash, but it was there. A figure, just at the edge of the trees. Too far to make out clearly, but close enough to send a jolt of fear through me. My heart raced as I dropped the gas cap, scrambling to pick it up and screw it back on. I didn't waste any more time. I jumped into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were trembling as I started the engine, glancing into the rearview mirror. But there was nothing behind me. The lot was empty, the gas station still and silent. I pulled out of the station, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped back onto the highway. My pulse was racing, my mind reeling from what I'd just seen, or thought I'd seen. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, my imagination getting the best of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I glanced back at the gas station as I drove away, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The lights were off, completely. The neon sign was dark, the store windows black, the whole station was dead, like it had never been open in the first place. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the gas station, my mind racing. There was no way the lights could have gone out that quickly. I'd just been there, just paid for gas. The guy behind the counter had taken my money. It was real, wasn't it? I threw the car into reverse, backing up a few hundred feet to get a better look. But the closer I got, the worse it became. The gas station was different, older. The pumps were rusted, the paint on the building faded and peeling. The windows were boarded up, the sign missing letters. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I sat there, frozen in my seat, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way this was the same station I'd just filled up at. No way. But as I stared at the darkened building, I knew deep down that it was. My hands shook as I shifted the car back into drive and peeled away from the station, my mind racing. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. I didn't want to see what else might be waiting for me in that place. I drove for miles, my heart still pounding in my chest, the dark highway stretching out endlessly in front of me. The further I got from the station, the lighter the air felt, the more normal things seemed, but that uneasy feeling never left me. When I finally pulled into the next town, I stopped at a brightly lit gas station, one with cars, people, and a cashier who actually looked like he belonged there. I went inside to pay, still shaken, and asked the attendant if he knew anything about the gas station back on Route 22. He frowned, shaking his head. That place? It's been closed for years, abandoned after a fire or something. No one goes there anymore. I stared at him, my stomach twisting. But I was just there, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I filled up my tank. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy. You must be mistaken, he said. There hasn't been gas at that place for a long time. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I just paid for a bottle of water and left, my mind still reeling from what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. Whatever that gas station was, whatever I'd experienced, I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't normal. I still drive Route 22 sometimes, but I've never stopped at that gas station again. In fact, I don't even look in its direction when I pass by. Some places are better left forgotten. Some places shouldn't exist at all. There's something about mountain roads that feels both thrilling and unsettling. The twists and turns, the way the drop-offs loom just a little too close for comfort. It keeps you on edge, even when you know exactly where you're going. But that night, driving up a remote mountain road I'd never been on, that edge turned into something else, something far more unnerving. I should have known better than to take a road that wasn't on the map. But in my defense, the detour sign left me no choice. It was supposed to be a simple drive to a friend's cabin for the weekend. I'd planned everything out, left early, packed snacks, downloaded some podcasts to keep me company. The first couple of hours went smoothly, the highway clear and the evening calm. But somewhere near the base of the mountain, I hit a detour. Roadwork, the sign said, with bright orange cones funneling me onto a side road. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't the first time a trip had taken me off course, and it usually just meant a few extra miles. But as I drove further up the winding road, I realized something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was how narrow the road became. It started off wide enough for 2 cars, but gradually, it seemed to shrink. The pavement was cracked, weeds growing up through the crevices, and the guardrails had rusted to the point of being useless. My headlights barely cut through the thickening fog that clung to the mountain, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I glanced at my GPS. No signal. Perfect. The deeper I went, the more isolated the road felt. The trees seemed to close in on either side, their branches hanging low and casting strange, distorted shadows across the road. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. Still, I pressed on. I had no choice. There was nowhere to turn around, no sign of a pull-off or an alternate route. My only option was to keep driving and hope the road would eventually connect back to the main highway. But then, I saw the sign. It was old, barely legible, its paint chipped and faded from years of neglect. But the words were still clear enough to read, "Dead end, 3 miles." I slowed down, my heart sinking. A dead end. That didn't make any sense. How could a detour lead to a dead end? I thought about turning around, but there was no space on the narrow road to do so safely. And backing up for miles on this foggy, twisting road wasn't exactly an appealing option. I decided to keep going, figuring I'd deal with the dead end when I got there. Maybe there was a small turnaround at the end, or a side road I hadn't noticed. But the further I drove, the stranger everything became. The trees pressed in closer, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog grew thicker, swirling around the car, making it feel like I was driving through some kind of dream. My headlights flickered, struggling to cut through the haze, and I could barely see the road anymore. And then, just ahead, I saw something on the side of the road. It was a car, an old, rusted sedan, half buried in the trees. The windows were smashed, and the tires had long since deflated, the metal frame sagging under its own weight. I slowed down as I passed it, my skin prickling with unease. There was no sign of anyone around, no indication of how long the car had been there or what had happened to it. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, left to rot on this forgotten stretch of road. A chill ran down my spine, and I pressed on the gas, eager to get away from the wreck. But the further I drove, the more uneasy I became. Something about the air felt wrong. Too thick, too heavy, like it was pressing in on me. And the fog, it wasn't natural. It clung to the trees and the road like it was alive, moving and shifting in ways that made me feel like I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing. Just the thick, impenetrable fog. I kept driving, the road growing narrower with each passing mile. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The dead-end sign had said 3 miles, but it felt like I'd been driving for much longer than that. The road stretched on endlessly, winding deeper into the mountain, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going the wrong way, that I wasn't supposed to be here. Finally, I saw it, a clearing ahead, where the road opened up slightly before coming to an abrupt stop. The dead end. I pulled into the clearing, the car's engine idling as I stared at the empty space in front of me. The road didn't continue. It simply stopped. No turnaround, no side road, just a sheer drop-off into the fog-covered valley below. My heart sank. I was stuck. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe I could turn the car around in the clearing, backtrack a bit, and find a place to pull over and think things through. But as I shifted the car into reverse, something caught my eye. Movement. It was faint, just a flicker in the fog, but there was no mistaking it. Something, or someone, was moving in the trees. I stared, my breath catching in my throat, as the shadowy figure emerged from the fog, its shape barely discernible in the dim light. At first, I thought it might be another driver, someone who had also gotten lost on this god-forsaken road. But as the figure came closer, I realized something was wrong. The way it moved, slow, deliberate, like it was gliding rather than walking, sent a chill through me. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel human. I slammed the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I backed up, trying to get as far away from the figure as possible. The tires screeched on the cracked pavement, the car lurching as I spun the wheel, trying to turn around in the narrow clearing. But then, the figure stopped. It stood there, just at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in fog. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its body, tall and thin, its arms hanging unnaturally long at its sides. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I finally managed to turn the car around, my foot slamming down on the gas. I sped back down the road, my headlights barely cutting through the thick fog. The trees blurred past me, the road twisting and turning as I fought to keep control of the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following me, but there was nothing. Just the fog, swirling in the car's wake, and the endless, winding road ahead. For what felt like hours, I drove. The road seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning through the dark, fog-covered mountain. I kept waiting for the moment when I'd reach the detour sign again, when I'd see the familiar stretch of highway and know I was safe. But it never came. The road just kept going, the fog growing thicker, the trees pressing closer. I felt like I was driving in circles, lost in some kind of endless loop, with no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog began to lift. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, as the road opened up in front of me. The trees thinned, the air cleared, and in the distance, I saw the familiar lights of the highway. I don't know how I got back to the main road. I don't know how long I'd been driving, or what had happened on that mountain road. All I know is that when I finally pulled back onto the highway, I didn't look back. I kept driving, my hands shaking, my mind racing with everything I'd just experienced. I've told a few people about that night, but no one believes me. They say I must have gotten lost, that I imagined the figure in the fog. But I know what I saw, and I know that road wasn't supposed to be there. There are places in this world that don't belong. Places that lead to nowhere, or worse, to something you're not supposed to find. And if you ever find yourself on a road that doesn't feel right, turn back, before it's too late. You ever have that feeling when you're driving late at night, and the world feels like it's asleep except for you? It's like you're the last person awake, and the road stretches on forever, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the lines on the asphalt to keep you company. That was me, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, on a road trip that was taking way longer than it should have. I hadn't planned on driving this late, but sometimes things don't go the way you plan. The road was deserted, just the occasional flicker of headlights in the opposite lane. My eyes were getting heavy, and the miles seemed to blur together. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. Somewhere off the main highway, hoping to find a place to crash for the night. My phone's GPS had stopped working miles ago. No signal out in the middle of nowhere, and the fuel gauge was dipping lower and lower. That's when I saw the sign. It was old, worn down, with flickering neon letters barely clinging to life. Vacancy. A motel, set back from the road, its parking lot half hidden by a line of scraggly trees. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, one of those rundown roadside motels you pass 100 times without thinking twice. But tonight, it was a sight for sore eyes. I pulled in, my tires crunching on the gravel as I parked in front of the office. The building was small, with a faded open sign hanging in the window. The lights were on inside, but something about the place felt off, like it had been left behind, forgotten. Still, I was too tired to care. All I wanted was a bed and a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again in the morning. I stepped out of the car and made my way to the office, the night air cool and heavy. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with wood-paneled walls and a musty smell that reminded me of old attics. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, hunched over a newspaper. He didn't look up when I walked in. "Hey," I said, my voice louder than I intended in the quiet room. "I need a room for the night." The man slowly raised his head, his eyes narrowing as he looked me over. He was pale, with deep wrinkles etched into his face and thin, wispy hair. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, he spoke. "You sure about that?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, the movement slow and deliberate. "Not many people stop here. Place hasn't seen much traffic in years." "Well, I'm here now," I said, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "Do you have a room, or not?" He stared at me for another moment before sighing and pushing a key across the counter. "Room 6, he muttered. "Down the left side. You pay in the morning." I grabbed the key, not bothering to thank him. and headed back outside. The motel had a row of doors lining the parking lot, each one marked with a faded number. I found room 6 easily enough and unlocked the door, stepping into the small, dimly lit room. It was about what I expected: dated furniture, an old TV on a rickety stand, and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. But it was clean enough, and that was all I cared about. I tossed my bag on the chair and sat down on the edge of the bed, letting out a long sigh. Finally, a place to rest. But as I sat there, something didn't feel right. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes the air feel heavy. I glanced around, my eyes lingering on the window. The curtains were drawn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just outside, watching. I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peek out. The parking lot was empty, my car the only one in sight. The office light was still on, but there was no sign of the old man. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned away, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I was tired, that was all. I lay down on the bed, kicking off my shoes and closing my eyes. The mattress was lumpy, but after hours on the road, it felt like heaven. I pulled the thin blanket over myself and tried to relax, telling myself I'd feel better after a few hours of sleep. But sleep didn't come. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the old air conditioning unit, but beyond that, nothing. No crickets, no distant cars, no wind rustling through the trees. Just nothing. And then I heard it. A soft knock, faint but unmistakable. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened, straining to hear, but the knock didn't come again. Maybe I'd imagined it. I was tired, on edge, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I lay back down, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled over me. Then the knock came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I shot out of bed, my pulse racing. Someone was outside the door. I stared at it, half expecting it to open on its own, but it didn't move. The knocking stopped, leaving the room in that same eerie silence as before. For a moment, I just stood there, my eyes locked on the door, waiting. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I open it? Yell out? But something in me, some deep, primal instinct, told me not to. Told me to stay away from that door. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my ears. The knocking didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was on the other side was still there, waiting. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and tried to check the time, but there was no signal. No Wi-Fi. I cursed under my breath, pacing the small room, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever was outside, but I didn't exactly want to go out there either. After what felt like an eternity, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait around to find out who was knocking. I grabbed my keys, threw on my shoes, and quietly moved toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sign of movement outside, but there was nothing. Just that same, oppressive silence. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could, my heart racing, and slowly opened it, just a crack. No one was there. The parking lot was empty, the motel dark and still. I stepped outside, glancing around, but there was no sign of anyone. The night was cold, the air still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the neon sign in the distance. I didn't waste any more time. I hurried to my car, unlocking it and throwing my bag into the back seat. As I climbed in and started the engine, I glanced up at the motel one last time, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the window of room 6. It was just a shadow, barely visible in the dim light, but I knew it wasn't me. It couldn't have been. I was sitting in my car, staring up at the room, and yet there it was, a dark silhouette standing perfectly still behind the curtain. I slammed the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I backed out of the lot. I didn't care about the gravel kicking up behind me or the fact that I was leaving without paying. I just needed to get out of there. As I sped down the empty road, my heart still pounding in my chest, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The motel was dark now, completely empty. The vacancy sign had gone out, and there was no trace of the figure in the window. I never told anyone about what happened that night. I'm not even sure what I saw, or if I imagined the whole thing, but I do know one thing. I'll never stay in a place like that again. Some motels are better left empty. There's something unnerving about being completely alone in the woods. At first, it's peaceful. The quiet, the solitude, the sense that you've left the rest of the world behind. But then, the isolation starts to settle in. You realize how far away you are from anyone who could help if something went wrong. That's when the peaceful quiet turns into something else. Something darker. Something that makes you feel like you're not as alone as you thought. It was supposed to be a solo hiking trip. 3 days in the mountains, just me, my backpack, and the trail. I'd done it before, and I liked the idea of disconnecting from everything. The plan was simple. Hike up to the ridge, camp overnight, and then spend the next couple of days exploring before heading back down. Nothing too intense, just enough to clear my head. The first day went smoothly. The trail was steep, but the weather was perfect, cool and crisp. With a bright, cloudless sky, I hiked for hours, enjoying the silence and the fresh air, stopping only to take in the occasional view of the valley below. By late afternoon, I'd reached a small clearing near the ridge where I decided to set up camp. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine. The trail was pretty narrow, and I figured I'd just doubled back on myself at some point. But as I crouched down to get a better look, I realized the prints were different. Larger than mine, and fresher. Whoever had made them had passed through recently. Very recently. I stood up, scanning the clearing, but there was no one in sight. Just the quiet of the woods and the fading light of the setting sun. I hadn't seen anyone all day, and this trail wasn't exactly a popular one. The idea that someone else was out here, so close to my camp, didn't sit right with me. But I shook it off. The woods were public, after all. People hiked them all the time. Maybe someone had passed through earlier and I just hadn't noticed. Still, as I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the woods grew darker, the shadows lengthening between the trees. I built a small fire, the flickering flames casting an orange glow over the clearing. The air was cool now, and the quiet had taken on a heavier, more oppressive quality. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I listened, straining to hear, but the noise had stopped. It could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But it hadn't sounded like an animal. It had sounded like footsteps. I stood up, the hair on the back of my neck prickling as I scanned the tree line. The fire crackled softly behind me, casting long shadows over the clearing. But there was no one there. No sign of movement. Just the dark shapes of the trees and the stillness of the night. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was out in the woods, alone. Of course I was going to hear things. My mind was playing tricks on me. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I forced myself to sit back down by the fire, trying to focus on the warmth of the flames, the steady crackle of the wood. But that feeling, the sense that I was being watched, never really went away. I turned in early, crawling into my tent and zipping it up tight. The small space felt comforting, and after a while, I started to relax. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. But just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and far too close. My eyes snapped open, my heart racing. The sound was faint, but it was there, moving slowly around the perimeter of my camp. I lay still, barely daring to breathe, my mind racing. Who was out there, and why were they circling my tent? The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing, just silence. And then, slowly, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, approaching my tent. I bolted upright, fumbling for the flashlight in my pack. My hands were shaking as I turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I shone it toward the entrance of the tent, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing, no one. I listened, holding my breath, but the footsteps were gone. The night was silent again. I sat there for what felt like hours, the flashlight still clutched in my hand, waiting. But there was no more sound, no more footsteps. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already high in the sky. The unease from the night before lingered, but in the daylight, it felt distant, almost silly. I stepped out of the tent, blinking in the bright light, and stretched. The woods were calm again, the birds chirping in the trees, the wind rustling the leaves. Everything felt normal, until I saw the footprints. They were everywhere, circling my camp in a perfect and deliberate pattern, larger than mine, and fresher, much fresher. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. Someone had been walking around my camp while I slept. The thought made my skin crawl. I grabbed my gear, my heart racing, and quickly packed up the tent. I didn't want to be here any longer than I had to. As I hiked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time the wind rustled the leaves, every time a branch snapped in the distance, I jumped. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one, just the quiet, empty woods. But the footprints hadn't been my imagination. Someone had been there, and they'd been watching me. The trail wound down through the trees, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before. The footsteps, the eerie silence like the feeling of being watched. It all felt so wrong. I was so focused on my thoughts that I almost didn't see him. A man, standing just off the trail, partially hidden by the trees. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his features, but close enough that I could see the way he was standing, still, almost too still, like he was waiting for something. I took a step back, my pulse racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. I didn't know who he was or why he was out here, but something about him, something about the way he was just standing there, set off every alarm bell in my head. I turned and started walking, my pace quickening, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following me. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the trees blurring together as I hurried down the mountain. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, even though I couldn't see him anymore. My legs were shaking, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. All I wanted was to get out of these woods, to get back to safety. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the trailhead. My car was parked there, waiting for me, and I practically sprinted the last few feet, fumbling with the keys as I unlocked the door and jumped inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and sat there for a moment, my heart still racing, my hands shaking. I glanced back up the trail, half expecting to see the man standing there at the edge of the trees. But there was no one. The woods were quiet again. I didn't wait around. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, speeding down the mountain road as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the highway, the safety of civilization in sight. I still don't know who that man was, or why he was watching me. Maybe he was just another hiker, someone who got lost or stumbled onto my camp by accident. Or maybe he wasn't. All I know is that I'll never hike that trail again. Some places, some experiences leave a mark on you, and I have no desire to find out what could have happened if I had stayed.